Good morning, everyone. Muy buenos días to everyone who is here with us today. Good morning, Catherine. Good morning, Rachel. How are you? Okay, so we want to begin promptly so that we can make as much of this morning today. I will just briefly introduce our opening statement by our Dean of the School of the Arts and Humanities at the Universidad Los Andes, Dr. Patricia Salamea. Dr. Salamea, welcome and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Veronica, and a very warm welcome and hello to the Universidad de los Andes, and in particular, our School of Arts and Humanities. You can see in my background, the image of our campus, and behind Veronica is the other side, as seen also from our campus. So although we are very sad not to have you on campus, on site, we're delighted to know that we have people connecting from many parts of the continent and the world, I hope, as well. So also a very special welcome and thanks to Catherine Manthorn, one of our co-organizers. It's lovely to see you again. And of course, our speakers, our guest lecturers, and all of our attendees, students, and professors. So very happy to have you here today and for the following days of this wonderful event. So in the first place, I would like to acknowledge with a very special thanks also to the Terra Foundation for American Art for supporting this wonderful event, co-organized by Professors Catherine Manthorn from the Graduate Center of CUNY and Professor Verónica Uribe, our chair from the Department of Art History here at Universidad de los Andes. Ever since I heard about this project, I was delighted for what this means, not just for art history and for our school, but really for many approaches to thinking about human intervention in landscape art across the Americas, of course, in the 19th century, but this will, I'm sure, make us think about many other issues that are pertinent to us now and in the future. So I really wanted also to think about this and what this means on a local, regional, but also continental scale of thinking about the Americas through our thoughts and processes regarding the arts, because we usually tend to separate Latin and North America. So I think this was a particularly interesting approach from the core organizers. And I also wanted to think about what this means for our university in terms of the Andean landscape, which you are seeing right here behind us. And also to think about Bogotá as a city, as a place of connection and a central point between the Americas, and of course, standing at our campus. And of course, this continental perspective that I think will allow us to think really about exchanges and transnational perspectives in art, which has been also one of the focuses of our Department of Art History. Furthermore, I think this idea of thinking about human intervention across the 19th century and across the landscape of the Americas really points to how urgent it has become to discuss and explore how we have left marks on the land and bringing really the natural landscape into dialogue with a cultural landscape, with the ongoing and current discussions about the Anthropocene and the role of art history ultimately in all of these very contemporary issues. So I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to thank all of you and welcome you to our online campus for now, hoping that we will have you here in the not too distant future to continue this discussion. So thank you again, Veronica, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. So good morning again, and welcome to the Universidad Los Andes, the School of Arts and Humanities and the Art History Department in Bogotá, Colombia. As many of you might have seen and heard for the past couple of weeks, Colombia has been navigating through very complex political and social times. We have been living a very sad and confusing moment in our country. As a university, school, and department, we have seen different manifestations of solidarity and empathy coming from our students and professors against violence and any other sort of violation of the human rights. We hope as art historians and humanists to be able to contribute engaging discussions and active participation in order for our country to see better times in the near future. I would like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the Terra Foundation for American Art for their support, not only for this event to be possible, but for their flexibility with all the changes that we have had to endure while organizing this symposium during a global pandemic. I would like to especially thank Professor Catherine Manthorn, who first came to me with the idea for this event and its theme, and who I partnered with in our application for the generous Terra grant that allows us to be here today. Dr. Manthorn's experience and feedback were essential for the organization of what promises to be a fantastic academic event. Thank you to our keynote speakers, Professor Rachael DeLue from Princeton University and Professor Marta Penos from the Universidad de Buenos Aires, who have also modified the details of their participation and have been amazing supporters of this upcoming discussion. I would like to include in my acknowledgements my wonderful group of colleagues, professors of the Art History Department, who have patiently changed plans continuously with us, who believed in the importance of this event from the beginning, and who have volunteered to be moderators in the different sessions. Special thanks to the Communications Office at the School of Arts and Humanities for the amazing communication and technical support from day one. Thank you, Próspero Carbonell, alumni of our Art History Master's degree, for volunteering to moderate a session. Luisa Fernanda Borja, undergraduate student of Art History and Literature, who has enthusiastically and with the best attitude endured mountains of emails and details. Thank you to the administration team of the Art History Department. Frederick Edwin Church arrived in Bogotá on June 6, 1853, following Alexander von Humboldt's footsteps. 11 days later, on June 17th, he climbed the mountain of Monserrate with Mr. Cyrus Field and then wrote in his diary, "This morning we climbed Monserrate. The ascent is very hard due to the lack of air, but the curious views compensated our effort." This mountain that we were meant to visit with our speakers would have probably taken our visitors' breath away, both literally and metaphorically. Because we cannot meet in person today, I have brought a photograph taken of Monserrate from our beautiful campus as my virtual background. Recognizing our venue is one of the many ways in which we can begin our comprehension of the landscape we inhabit and of the human intervention that is now part of its history. As a professor of the Universidad de los Andes, as co-organizer of the symposium, as an art historian of 19th century landscape art, I must acknowledge the place where this event was born during a conversation in Bogotá with Dr. Manthorn at the end of 2018. The history of this mountain that frames many views of our capital city is one crossed by Muisca indigenous peoples, the history of Spanish colonization, our Catholic traditions, the history of tourism in Bogotá, and very complex current social and ecological problems. I hope that one day you can all climb this amazing peak and visit our beautiful campus next to it. On the first week of March last year, I sent an email to my colleagues organizing some of our events for the 2020 Landscape Art of the Americas Symposium scheduled for May. We scheduled lunch meetings, excursions, museum visits, and session moderators. A month after that, Professor Manthorn and I were urgently convening via Zoom with the Terra Foundation in order to understand how to go about the postponement of this event. What remained of the original plan was the symposium program and my generous colleagues as moderators. Virtuality allows us to have participants from many places today, but in-person meetings allow us to have more informal conversations, have a cup of Colombian coffee, and discuss landscape and human intervention issues in a different place, as well as it allows us to approach our interest in landscape art while understanding the logics of the tropics, the altitude on the plateau of Bogotá, the weather in Bogotá, our multiple climate zones, and urgent conversations on eco-critical art history. For 3 non-consecutive days, during our opening and closing keynote lectures and 8 panel sessions, participants and assistants will engage with fresh approaches to landscape art in discussions that allow problematic conversations about the definition of landscape art in a cross-hemispheric, interdisciplinary, and multimedia approach. We welcome you to the Landscape Art of the Americas Sites of Human Intervention across the 19th Century International Symposium, and we thank you so much for being here. A couple of announcements as to our logistics. Every session will have a moderator who will collect questions via the chat and who at the end of each session will also organize and moderate questions for our speakers. Moderators will give you turns for direct microphone interventions and questions at the end. Please raise your hand at the end of the session and moderators will give out the turns. Please follow our program on the Symposium website for the breaks and sessions. And thank you again for being here. Patricia, thank you for your amazing support for this event, Dr. Manthorn and Dr. DeLue. I think we are right on time, so I will begin with the introduction for our opening lecture, Dr. Rachael DeLue. The program, thank you. The program is on the chat. The program link is on the chat if anybody needs to follow the details of the timing. Professor Rachael Zihari DeLue is the Christopher Binion Seraphim 86 Professor in American Art in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University and is currently the chair of the department. At Princeton, she holds a joint appointment with Princeton's program in American Studies. Professor DeLue specializes in the history of American and transatlantic art and visual culture, with particular focus on intersections among art, science, and the history and theory of knowledge, and on the transnational and transcultural formation of America as a complex geography, identity, and idea. She edited Picturing 2016, she serves as the editor-in-chief of the Terra Foundation essays, and she edited Picturing in 2016, the first volume in the series. She has also published George Inness and the Science of Landscape 2004, Landscape Theory 2008, co-edited with James Elkins, and Arthur Dove, Always Connect 2016. Other recent publications consider the work of the modern artist Romare Bearden, Spike Lee's film Bamboozled, Shoreline Landscapes as Symbols of Empire, Natural History in the Context of Settler Colonialism, and the Construction of Native America in 18th and 19th Century Archaeology and Ethnography. Professor DeLue is currently working on a book about impossible images, pictures of entities and phenomena that should be unpicturable because they are unseen or ungraspable, beyond the limits of perception or comprehension. She is also researching a study on Darwin's diagram, the only illustration to appear in On the Origins of Species, when it was published in 1859. At Princeton, she teaches a wide range of undergraduate and graduate courses on American culture, history and identity, and on the intersection between the history of art and the history of science. Professor DeLue will open our symposium with her keynote lecture, Figures in a Landscape, Picturing Human Agency and the Will of Nature in the 19th Century. Thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Let me share my screen and get that set up before I start. I'm learning. All right, so my participant screen sharing has been disabled. So if you could enable that, that would be great. This is.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, perfect, thank you. One of the things we've learned this past year is how well we can adapt to technology, but also that technology isn't always a perfect mechanism. So let me just start by saying how thrilled I am to be here. This has been an adventure getting here, less so for me than for the organizers. And I'm just going to move my square over so I'm not looking right in my own face. There we go. More so for the organizers than myself. Verónica and Kathy and their team at the university and at the Terra have worked tirelessly over the past year to make this possible. And I'm so grateful, first of all, that none of this was canceled. I'm sorry that I'm not there with you in Bogotá, and I'm very, very sorry not to be able to climb the peak, but I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled that we're gathering together here virtually. And it was truly heartwarming to see the messages pour in the chat as we were warming up to the proceedings. I feel very much as if I'm among my people. So I feel very much at home with all of you. So again, thank you to everyone who is here. Thank you to Verónica and Kathy and their team, to Dean Zalamea for her wonderful introduction of the proceedings and her support of this event. So I'm going to start with a quote from the American philosopher and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I'm showing, whoops, sorry about that. I'm showing here the entirety of the quote with the selections that I'll highlight in bold. The line in question comes from Emerson's essay, Arte, which appeared in 1841. In the opening paragraphs of this essay, Emerson argues that the fine arts, because they aspire to beauty over and against mere utility, the fine arts should not simply imitate the natural world. Rather, in pictures of landscape, Emerson explained, the painter should give the suggestion of a fairer creation than we know. To do so, the artist, Emerson says, must not fuss over detail, but instead aim to convey only a scene's spirit and splendor. Emerson's vision of landscape as an elevating or intensifying medium, as a genre in pursuit of what might be described as an extra natural delineation of the natural world. This vision serves quite well as a criterion for landscape painting in the 19th century in the United States. In order to be a proper landscape, the criterion stipulates, a painting must present to its viewers a vision of nature embellished with beauty and sublimity laid on thick. Take, for instance, this painting by the artist Asher B. Durand. Durand's meticulous attention to detail evokes the look and feel of a forest glade, the soft velvety green of moss growing in the shady damp of the woods, the reddish brown crumble of logs decomposing on the forest floor, the crisp and curling fronds of ferns, the scatter of sunlight amidst the trees and leaves and on the surface of the stream. But these details exist within a view of nature that Durand configured to produce a maximum aesthetic effect. Trees and branches incline inward in the scene to create a cathedral-like space. Contrasting areas of dark and light heighten the drama of the scene. A spot of cloud-laden blue in the far distance beckons us, altar-like, to approach. A quietly meandering stream leads us from the foreground into the distance, from the depths of the forest to a higher, more exalted state. Nature in this painting is beautiful, welcoming, and infused with higher meaning, made by Durand into, indeed, a far fairer creation than the everyday woods through which he would have regularly trekked. The charming squirrel that sits unperturbed on the log in the foreground, casting a friendly glance the viewer's way, and the bird at the right that flits charmingly through the trees, tracking the course of the stream, seemingly unaware of any presence but its own. These forest creatures further idealize the scene, offering up this sun-dappled grove as a piece of untouched Edenic nature, a natural paradise untrammeled by humans, its redemptive wildness extolled by Durand's brush. Emerson's sense of a landscape as a genre that subjects the natural world to the improvements of the artist's hand dates to the earliest use of the term landscape in English in the 17th century. Be they sublime, beautiful, or picturesque, landscapes brought into being by the discerning human gaze exist to please and to delight the eye and mind. Landscapes do so by presenting the viewer with pleasing and delightful things. Pleasing and delightful precisely because in many cases, including in the Durand, humans are absent, or at least have not yet had a chance to muck things up. Or if they have mucked things up, that is, the artist does his best to clean up the mess. In this painting of Lake George, for instance, the artist John Frederick Kensett undertakes just this sort of damage control, ridding the landscape of all signs of New York State's booming tourism trade and limiting the human presence in the scene to a solitary figure at left, barely discernible, who quietly and unobtrusively paddles a canoe. This is a painting right in line with Emerson's edict and with the Durand, an example of what has long been understood as exemplary of and necessary to the landscape genre in the 19th century. Pictures that give us nature at its fairest, most splendid aspect, and that imagine a happy, harmonious, and non-invasive relationship between the human and the natural world. Even the most foreboding seeming paintings, those that do not invite us to stay a while, those that make us shudder rather than smile, even these incite pleasure precisely because in them, the natural world not only remains untouched, but often exists as wholly external to or in sheer excess of the human. In the painting that I show you here, titled Old Ocean's Gray and Melancholy Waste from 1885, the artist William Tross Richards fills the horizontal sweep of his canvas with just sea and sky. Cropping at the left and the right edges evokes the idea of an infinite expanse. And Richards includes in his ocean view no sign of human life. No land, no boats, not even a bird. Even the viewer is figuratively banished from the scene, resigned to imagine being suspended over the ocean in midair, fictively hovering above the gray expanse. The empty nothingness of Richards's painting evokes the ocean's incomprehensibility from a human's point of view, suggesting that to know the ocean, to make the ocean into a fathomable identity, a fathomable entity, one must become something else, or at the very least endeavor to see the ocean from an extra human or even alien point of view. Hence the impossible perspective that Richard forces his viewer to adopt, and hence his evacuation of any trace of habitable, navigable, mappable space from the scene. Richards borrowed the title of his painting, Old Ocean's Gray and Melancholy Waste, from the American poet William Cullen Bryant's Thanatopsis, which appeared in 1821. In the poem, Thanatopsis, Bryant presented a meditation on the eternal omnipresence of nature and the inescapable mortality of man. In the passage that gave Richards his title, Bryant describes the insignificance of the human in relation to the sheer scope and vitality of the natural world. Next to nature, Bryant writes, man can appear bereft of life. The venerable woods, he writes, rivers that move in majesty, and the complaining brooks that make the meadows green, and poured round old ocean's gray and melancholy waste, are but the solemn decorations all of the great tomb of man. Nature, Bryant suggests here, is so vast, so majestic, so beyond comprehension, so exponentially in excess of the human subject, that relative to nature, any human might as well be dead, entombed in his own insignificance. A sobering thought, to be sure, the idea that the human condition, when considered alongside the natural world, is nothing more than a form of death, albeit metaphorical. And yet, there is pleasure, joy even, in contemplating the sheer insignificance of human life in the face of Richard's empty, watery expanse. Emerson's edict thus still holds sway. For Richards, in compelling an exquisite face-off with the alien ocean, makes the most fundamental truth about human life, that it ends in death, and that next to nature, the human was never really anything at all. Richard makes this sobering truth a spectacle to admire, or at least at which to marvel, thus transforming the inelegant and material bluntness of mortality into an alluring, spine-tingling, mythic tale. As Emerson wrote in his 1841 essay, the best landscape painter gives the sunshine of sunshine, but also the gloom of gloom. But what happens when a landscape presents not a fairer creation, but a degraded terrain? When a landscape is ugly instead of beautiful? When its gloom is just that, gloomy, and refused to be redeemed by the beautiful or the sublime? What I'm showing you here is one such landscape painted by the artist Homer Dodge Martin, which depicts the clear-cut and blasted slope of an iron mine on Lake Champlain in northern New York. Although the painting is currently dated circa 1862, it was very likely created a decade later in the 18th mine, Port Henry, New York. The work most likely depicts an iron mine at Split Rock Mountain near the town of Westport. Archival evidence suggests that Martin painted this picture on commission for William McGeer Tweed, the notorious boss Tweed of 19th century New York's democratic political machine, Tammany Hall. Tweed was a majority shareholder in the mining company that ran the Split Rock Mountain operation. And in commissioning the painting, he would have been one among many businessmen and captains of industry in the period, ordered up paintings to showcase the gems in their financial crowns. I'm showing you here a period photograph of the Split Rock mine, and on the right, a stock certificate from the mining company in which Tweed owned a majority stake. And you can see I've included a detail of the stock certificate that has Tweed's signature on it. With such a commission, Martin, the artist, had to accommodate not just boss Tweed, but period conventions of landscape painting. He had to accommodate these conventions to a terrain, an iron mine, usually well outside the purview of the landscape genre. This explains certain of the painting's odd and unconventional features, including the very fact that it takes as its subject rocks and rubble. Martin tried to make this scene of wreckage picturesque through vivid color and elegant brushwork, and he reserved a spot of earth in the left foreground on which the viewer could imagine standing, and from there happily enjoy the view. But in the end, Martin's painting shows what it shows: a denuded landscape, a terrain that has been gutted and stripped bare. In this way, Martin's painting presents what the American historian and critic Lewis Mumford in his 1961 book, The City in History, what Mumford characterized as a process of unbuilding, which he directly associated with modern mining. Unbuilding for Mumford entailed the non-natural, even perverse destruction of a place without any replacement or reconstitution of that locale's vital matter. Mining, more than anything else, human or natural, radically depleted nature, leaving only wasteland and absence in its wake. And here I'm showing you on the right a period photograph of a mine in California, and on the left a photograph taken this year of a mine in also in California. By the time Martin created his painting of the Split Rock iron mine, the mining, timber, and railroad industries had radically transformed and decimated the Lake Champlain region, clearing forests and hollowing out hillsides, unbuilding the landscape piece by piece. Martin's painting presents the viewer with just such a scene: bright orange tailings, the waste residue of iron ore extraction streak the barren, blasted, and burnt out slope. A single mine shaft visible in the painting's left half provides access to deposits below the surface, while rocks and rubble tumble downhill, piling into heaps at the shore. Mature trees, most of them evergreens, cluster along the upper edge of the hill and at its base, but the rest of the hillside bears only hints of vegetation. Although certain sections of the painting are painted with precision, for the most part, Martin rendered his forms loosely and lyrically, which you can see in this detail, shaping these forms with skittering and twisting strokes of color that defy the solidity of their real world reference. In combination with the tailings that sweep down the hill, the rocks that tumble from the tunnel entrance, and the thin stream that splashes toward the lake at left, Martin's fluid twisting strokes create the effect of the painting as a whole moving and flowing, as if evoking molten iron produced by a blast furnace, or even the superheated formation of the Earth's crust, abundant with iron. But Martin's agitated brushwork, above all, indicates a landscape in the process of coming undone. One could wrangle Martin's painting into the landscape genre, or into a proper place within the landscape genre, by passing it off as a portrait of place. But a mine is an odd sort of place, an odd sort of landscape. A mine exists as a location, but by its very nature, it entails the removal of large portions of the site, a shearing and emptying out that flies in the face of the notion of a continuous identity attached to a constant, unchanging locale. In this case, Split Rock Mountain, past, present, and future. Mining, one could say, following Mumford, upends any sense of place that depends on the persistence of familiar characteristics or the habitual availability of a recognizable view. Martin's painting narrates such a disassembling, a once familiar landscape stripped and pitted and made over into something radically other than its original self. The darkened hollow of the mine shaft signals the absences and voids that paradoxically constitute such a locale, or more accurately, that ensure that the Split Rock site exists as no place at all. The empty boat, the uninhabited dock, the house with the open shadow-filled door, these features too configure the scene as simultaneously here and not here. A once familiar locale in the process of emptying out, losing its identity and becoming null. Other mining landscapes from the period present a similar narrative of unbuilding, of natural aggregation followed by unnatural extractive deformation, including the example I show you here, painted by the landscape artist Robert S. Duncanson in 1848 on commission for the Pittsburgh investor minister, and abolitionist Charles Avery, Duncanson's work depicts a copper mine located in the state of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and operated by the Pittsburgh and Boston Mining Company, in which Avery, who commissioned the painting, was a major stakeholder. And here I show you a period map and diagram of the mine and its works. Avery's commission of the painting supported Duncanson's early efforts as an artist, while also commemorating the success of what was then the most profitable copper mine in the United States, as well as Avery's leading role in the profitable adventure. Duncanson did what he could with vibrant color, a palette of rich reds, browns, and greens, to enliven and beautify the scene. The sprightly vegetation in the foreground and the trees that adorn the distant bluff also gesture towards the idea of an idyllic landscape view. But the end result, the final upshot, is a decimated terrain. A deep gash in the cliff at the center of the canvas represents the shaft that was blasted and dug out to access a massive vein of copper discovered in 1845. The ragged remnants of trees chopped down to build the many structures visible in the painting litter the slopes on either side of the Eagle River, which runs alongside the cliff. Piles of pulverized copper and waste rock sit amongst the buildings, and assorted laborers attend to various aspects of the extraction and refining process. The runoff and debris from the mine has turned the river reddish brown, while dust and smoke raised by the crushing and smelting of copper ore suffuse the scene. To repeat what I said a moment ago, as a terrain of ongoing deformation in a perpetual state of unbuilding, a mine presents an odd, even impossible subject for landscape. This is the case, again, because landscape in the 19th century was supposed to be an aggregating and amplifying genre, a pictorial format bent on celebrating and improving nature through art. As an additive process, landscape served to convey, but also to amplify nature's beauty and plenitude, and above all, to preserve the myth of nature's eternal and unchanging presence as nature, as the natural over and against the human or the human-made. Mining thus manifested as a problem for nature and for the environment, and as a problem for representation. For it presented the artist with a radical loss of form, with absence and deprivation, with a deficit of material to paint rather than a bounty of things to depict. I'm showing you here two more examples from the period, a painting on the left of a mine in Weaverville, Trinity County, California from around 1870, and on the right from 1886, Harry Learned's Iron Mask Mine in Colorado. The prevailing wilderness aesthetic, along with the tried and true landscape conventions of the 19th century United States, were not equipped to tolerate a terrain such as these, undone by human use, a terrain in the midst of transforming into a non-place. And it follows that the subject of a mining operation presented a sizable challenge to the landscape genre. Here are two more examples, not from the United States. The one on the left is from Australia. It shows gold diggings in Ararat. It's a painting created in around 1855. And on the right is a watercolor scene of mining works and the coastline of Cornwall. And I find the watercolor on the right especially interesting because it combines the ravaged landscape of a mine with various picturesque elements, like two individuals perched on a cliff looking out over the scene, as if to enjoy the mine as a kind of picturesque ruin. And I show you these from Australia and England to give you a sense that in talking about the United States, I'm talking about the landscape genre as such in a way that I think is applicable in a transnational sense. So the pictorial conundrum, this pictorial conundrum raises an important question about art historical inquiry now, the pictorial conundrum presented by the mine. because the challenge presented to the landscape genre in the 19th century by mining persists today in the so-called age of the Anthropocene. The question I have in mind goes something like this. What do we as scholars of art and visual culture do with landscapes that exist radically against the grain? Images that defy the expectations of the genre, by presenting views of nature's undoing by humans, ravaged and ruinous prospects instead of delightful natural scenes. Do we treat such pictorial prospects as exceptions to the rule? Or do we see them as an opportunity to rewrite the rules, to reimagine what might be said about the genre of landscape in the United States and beyond? To address these questions, I'm going to take us on a brief detour to South America. Some of you won't experience this as a detour because you're in fact there at this very moment, as I very much wish I was. And a number of you on this call will not be surprised that I've managed to find a way to get Humboldt into the mix. So I'm going to take us to South America and to the work of the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt in order to address the questions that I just posed. Humboldt was not a landscape artist per se, but his scientific pursuits led him to create a series of truly innovative and complex images of terrain. As is well known, Humboldt spent 5 years in the Americas from 1799 to 1804, accompanied on his travels by the French botanist Aimé Bonpland. His expedition covered thousands of miles and took him to many different regions, including Cuba, Venezuela, and the United States and Mexico, as well as to large sections of the Andes mountain range in Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. Shortly after Humboldt's return to Europe in 1804, he set about publishing his findings on the features of these many and diverse regions. This included in 1807, one of the earliest publications to come out of the travels, his essay on the geography of plants, which would turn out to be a foundational text in the fields of ecology and biogeography for its groundbreaking account of the geographic distribution of plants in the Andes as a function of both elevation and climate. To accompany the text of the essay on the geography of plants, Humboldt, with Bonpland's help, created a large-scale fold-out color plate, which you see here, entitled Physical Tableau of the Andes and Neighboring Countries. The physical tableau is divided into 3 main sections. The middle section features a schematic rendering of 2 peaks in the Andean range, Chimborazo and Cotopaxi. And I'm showing you on the right a detail of that middle section that actually comes from the German edition, which is why, in addition to some of the Latin names of the plant species, you see German language rather than French. In this middle section, Humboldt and Bonpland carefully annotated the slopes of the mountain range with the Latin names of plant species native to the region, which they arranged in the drawing according to location and elevation. Humboldt and Bonpland took great care to tilt, bend, or curve the text of each plant name in order to indicate with precision the horizontal and vertical distribution of a given species. On either side of the central image, a series of columns display data collected by Humboldt and Bonpland and others in the course of their travels. The columns include familiar measurements such as temperature, barometric pressure, and altitude, as well as more unfamiliar, even obscure quantities such as the blueness of the sky as measured by a cyanometer, the distance at which mountains can be seen from the point of view of sea level, and the scale of animals with respect to the elevation of their habitats. The amount of information presented in this image is, to say the least, impressive. I would think astonishing and mind-boggling might be better adjectives. The central section of this picture, I say this because the central section of this picture contains within its frame tens of thousands of square meters of terrain and includes the names of over 500 individual plant species. Together, the 20 columns of data include close to 1,000 distinct observations and measurements. In presenting this wealth of information, Humboldt employed a rich diversity of notational systems and representational modes, integrating all of them along with the picture and the data into a single graphic field. Letters, numbers, words, symbols, images, and abstract patterns and shapes jostle for attention. Genres and formats, landscape, diagram, map, profile, caption, annotation, table, chart, combine and recombine to create a packed and prolific array. Humboldt's physical tableau introduced a new visual format to the physical sciences, one that departed from the prevailing specimen-based and mimetic model of natural history illustration. And I'm showing you here a botanical illustration that came out of Humboldt's expedition. This comes from a book on which he and Bonpland collaborated with the botanist, the German botanist Carl Sigismund Kunth, and it depicts the specimens that Humboldt and Bonpland observed and or collected in the Americas in a very conventional manner against a blank ground, with their parts arrayed so as to provide a maximal view of the plant's form and anatomy. So Humboldt's physical tableau produced a new visual format, and his departure from prevailing graphic methods in the period was purposeful and reflected his rejection of long-standing hyper-specialized approaches to studying the natural world. Botanists studying plants, zoologists studying animals, mineralogists studying rocks, meteorologists studying weather, chemists studying the properties of matter, and so forth. All of these specialists accumulating masses of knowledge about one thing in nature, but none of them ever really formulating a deep understanding of the natural world writ large. Such specialized study fell short, according to Humboldt, because nature, despite its vastness and its infinite variety, at a global register, consisted of a unified and stable whole, held together in a state of equilibrium that arose from the essential interlinking of all entities, forces, and phenomena on Earth. Everything in nature, the distribution of plant species in the Andes, barometric pressure on the Canary Islands, electric eels in the Amazon's rivers, volcanic eruptions in Mexico, the temperature of the Earth's interior, the intensity of the sun at higher elevations, everything in nature, as Humboldt saw it, was caused by or causal of everything else. Nothing existed in isolation, no matter how singular or remote. Such interconnection and interdependency for Humboldt in turn reflected his sense of the fundamental logic and order of the cosmos, including the essential lawfulness, regularity, and predictability of the natural world. Consequently, Humboldt believed, fervently believed, any scientist desiring a full understanding of nature had to be all manner of scientists at once, and had to study all things everywhere. Only by observing and measuring everything in the natural world and synthesizing the results could nature's order be discerned. Such a synthetic and capacious approach materializes in the physical tableau, which in its voracious accumulation of myriad types of data and multiple expressive forms, strives to articulate the cosmos by way of this teeming aggregated array as a single super integrated system, all of its parts intricately interwoven into a perfectly organized whole. In order to create the physical tableau, Humboldt surveyed vast stretches of terrain and extracted multiple forms of data as he went. And I'm showing you here the physical tableau adjacent to 2 pages of Humboldt's American travel journals, which amount to thousands and thousands of pages overall. And the pages show you examples of the kind of data that he accumulated in the field, which then found, at least some of it found its way into the physical tableau. So Humboldt gathered data in the field, and then he processed the piles of data he had gathered after the fact, refining this data from a raw state into scientific meaning, in this case, in the form of the physical tableau, the visual and quantitative array of this extraordinary image. In this way, the operations that led to the physical tableau resemble those that unfold at a mine, at least in a figurative sense. Humboldt's extraction of data counts as its own sort of unbuilding of nature. And the resulting image is something like a landscape in reverse, a prospect that rises into a fragmentary and unnatural state through the dismantling and systematic quantification, in Humboldt's case, of its terrain. An image of nature created by virtue of the disarticulation of the natural world and the reordering of its features into a field of data. The mountain slope that appears in cross-section, riddled with the names of hundreds of plants, embodies just such a generative dismantling. To show the truth of nature, in this case, the fact that climate and elevation determine which species of plant will grow where, Humboldt took nature apart, unbuilding it into something quite other than its given natural state. Again, he does this. He excavates and disassembles the natural world in order, paradoxically, to reveal it at its most essential and pure, nature as it really, truly, ultimately is. Although paintings of mining like those made by Duncanson and Martin do not, on the face of it, appear to have much in common with Humboldt's physical tableau, the comparison, to my mind, is apt. I say this because these paintings, and I'm showing you Martin's here, these paintings as landscapes in reverse or anti-landscapes, these paintings put the lie to any picture of landscape that in the 19th century purported to show nature in a wholly natural state, untouched by human civilization. In the present day, we know very well that human activity in one part of the world can impact another vastly distant part, including remote locales that seem well beyond humanity's reach. The artist Chris Jordan tells us as much in the series of photographs he took beginning in 2009 on the Midway Atoll, a tiny stretch of land in the middle of the North Pacific, 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. And I'm showing you a map on the right to give you a sense of its remoteness, the remoteness of the Midway Atoll. The island, the Midway Atoll, is a major albatross nesting site. And while there, Jordan took dozens of photographs of the plastic-filled stomachs of dead albatross chicks. By bringing viewers face to face with the very far away, the photographs, Jordan's photographs, collapse the distance between the here and the there, between human settlement and one of the most remote and what ought to be, or what we imagine ought to be, one of the most pristine places on Earth. Images of bird bellies filled with trash on the Midway Atoll explode the myth that nature in the age of humans has ever been pure, offering up a decidedly dystopian view of Humboldt's magnificent vision of the essential interconnection and interdependency among all life on Earth. Humboldt's physical tableau, its utopianism notwithstanding, forces, I think, a similar reckoning with the inexorable entanglement of human activity and the natural world, precisely because it claims to present the viewer with the most natural state of nature by way of nature's wholesale rearrangement and re-representation at the hands of man. If one reads the physical tableau against the grain and thinks not just about the final product, the image itself, but the process of the image as a material artifact coming into being, it becomes all the more impossible to see what is depicted in it as nature on its own, inviolable and undisturbed by humans. Rather, what one confronts is a series of places through which Humboldt and his sizable cadre of associates, laborers, pack mules, and equipment had tread. The physical tableau with its teeming hordes of data tracks and embodies the movement and actions of Humboldt and his crew, whose very presence in nature was the thing that caused the physical tableau and its vision of undisturbed nature to exist. And here I'm showing you an image that I very, very much hope to see in Bogotá in person. This is in the museum, the National Museum of Colombia in Bogotá. And here I pay homage to it from a distance. This is a sketch by Francisco José de Caldas after a sketch made by Humboldt, preliminary to the physical tableau. Present, if latent in Humboldt's physical tableau, then, are the trappings and time of travel and scientific exploration, the instruments, sketch pads, and notebooks used to gather data in the field, the forces, phenomena, and conditions that gave rise to that data, including the weather, ocean currents, and the Earth's rotation, the data itself, and the multiple notational methods employed to communicate quantitative information in writing, the individuals in Europe and the Americas who supplied Humboldt with measurements he could not acquire himself, the South American scientists who shared their deep knowledge with Humboldt's team, the men for hire in the Andes that made his expedition possible, the indigenous informants who provided Humboldt with invaluable information about the terrain and its plant, animal, and human inhabitants, and the illustrators, engravers, and printing firms that collaborated in preparing the fold-out illustration back in Paris. What this leaves us to understand, and I'm showing you this sketch to give you a sense of the physical tableau in process as a thing that came into being over a period of over 4 years. What this leaves us to understand is that the very act of venturing out into nature to fathom nature in its most unadulterated state precludes any possibility of ever doing so. The thousands and thousands of acts of bushwhacking, measuring, collecting, and consulting that occurred under Humboldt's watch over the course of 5 years meant that every move he made to discern the fundamental workings of the natural world disrupted or unbuilt just these workings. Such disruption materializes in rather literal fashion in the physical tableau. Between the picture in the center, and I'll show you this again in a minute, a landscape scene, albeit a schematic and excavated one, and the masses of quantitative data contained in the flanking columns. And I'm showing you here pages from Humboldt's personal narrative. These are 2 of several pages that list the various precision instruments he took with him in the field. Humboldt was obsessive about his instrumentation and obsessive about obtaining as precise as possible measurements. And the list of instruments is almost like a list of dramatis personae at the beginning of a play, as if the instruments went along with Humboldt as collaborators of a sort. So the central image and the quantitative data that flanks it clash in a really interesting way as the measure of all manner of natural entities, forces, phenomena. These numbers, this quantitative data, stand in for what Humboldt encountered during his travels, the material real manifesting in the form of a numerical array. Measurements are not natural. A quantity like temperature or barometric pressure exists not as an essential and inherent quantity, not as an essential and inherent quality of the natural world, but by virtue of the act of measurement itself and by virtue of the operations and capacities of the instruments doing the measuring, from thermometers and barometers to telescopes, sextants, and magnometers. There is for example, to explain, no 23 degrees Celsius in nature. 23 degrees Celsius is a quantity generated in relation to nature by human hands and human tools. This means that the natural world, which is described in the physical tableau as an agglomeration of measurements, the height of mountains, the temperature on the summit of Chimborazo, the barometric pressure at sea level, the saturation of the blue of the sky when perceived from the ground, the rock formations found in the equatorial region. This means that the natural world in the physical tableau materializes to a great extent as measurement, by which I mean that the terrain that one sees in Humboldt's picture is not nature at all, but rather a vast field of human activity, one generated, as with a mine, by human intervention and extraction. This, I think, was in many ways Humboldt's point. As I said a moment ago, and on the way to closing my remarks, Humboldt envisioned the world as a super integrated entity, all of its parts working in sync to sustain, in his words, one great whole. In his estimation, the natural world and the human, rather than existing in separate spheres or as different categories of being, were fundamentally and essentially interwoven. To study a particular terrain was thus to study the whole shebang: plants, animals, climate, geology, the Earth's atmosphere, the solar system, and along with all of these things, the entirety of human culture. No proper or rigorous account of the cosmos, Humboldt believed, could leave the human out. In this way, Humboldt might be described as an early theorizer of the Anthropocene, our current geological age, defined as a period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on the Earth's climate and environment. In turn, one might characterize the physical tableau as a prescient visualization of the conditions of our present age, as an image of the natural world that presents the viewer with something other than nature made over into a fairer creation. Something that is not landscape, or not what landscape in the 19th century was supposed to be. The physical tableau offers a template for re-seeing and rethinking the genre of landscape then and now. I say this because the physical tableau not only compels a broadening of long-standing conceptions and definitions of landscape, it summons a wholesale reimagining of the very idea of landscape as it manifested in Europe and the United States in the modern period, provoking us to ask not just what counts as landscape, but what landscape ultimately is, in both a categorical and an ontological sense. Put another way, Humboldt's physical tableau opens onto an understanding of landscape that is as much Duncanson's troubled view of an copper mine as it is Duran's exalted forest glade. And it refashions each as impure and promiscuous systems, inclusive of all beings, forces, phenomena, and entities on Earth. What Humboldt's promiscuous picture ultimately gives one to know is that there are always figures in a landscape, that all landscapes, from Duran's idyllic view to Duncanson's degraded terrain, are unbuilt rather than untouched. All landscapes, Humboldt's physical tableau proclaims, exist as nature in reverse. And our job as scholars is to follow their lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for wonderful, wonderful talk. And this relationship from going to North America, coming down to South America, including Caldas, who has recently also been included in a lot more studies, and there's been a lot of discussions also about the relationship, right, between Caldas and Humboldt, and to see if Caldas was kind of undermined by Humboldt's fame. So we have a question. We have a first question by Spencer Wigmore, I can open up your microphone. I will do that. And I think you can do that. And you can ask Dr. DeLue the question.
Yes, thank you for this really phenomenal talk. This is great. And I was really curious about if you could talk a little more about how distance is operating in these landscapes. I think because mining investors, for instance, would often fund mines kind of sight unseen, thousands of miles away. I mean, using these sort of textual forms of information, and they could develop this relationship without ever needing to be on site, without ever having to occupy a view that's analogous with the view of the landscape painting. So I guess I'm curious if that distanced vantage, that 1,000-mile view of the investor is ever registered or can be located or identified in like a Dodge Martin or a Duncanson, a picture like that. Where do we go and find that dynamic in a landscape painting?
Yeah, so that's a super question, and it's I'll reference a wonderful essay by Daniela Bleichmar it's either Cultures of Natural History or Worlds of Natural History that talks about how scientific imagery and texts from the period were produced based on field exploration, but were meant to travel back to Europe or places in North America in order to kind of collapse the distance, both between people interested in the scientific discoveries, but also investors interested in the land and its natural resources. I mean, Humboldt was, of course, trained as a miner and was a surveyor of mines for a long time. And his work in South America was putatively scientific, but he did it under the aegis of the Spanish Empire and with the permission of the Spanish Empire. And he triggered what one might call a mineral rush in the Americas. And I think some of his very, very early drawings in the Americans were what he termed pasigraphy, which were specific to mining and which describe the kinds of rocks that one can find in South American terrain. So I think the distance, the idea of showing investors possibilities and resources to exploit at a distance, that wasn't at all latent in his imagery. I think he wanted to lay that bare, and his publications include long chapters on mineral resources and mining operations in the Americas. So I think I don't think that what's the word? I don't think Humboldt was disingenuous in any way about proclaiming the sheer scientific purpose of his work. I think his images and his texts addressed straightforwardly and explicitly investors at a distance.
Anna Marley, I'll invite you to ask. I'm opening your microphone so that you can ask your question directly.
Thank you, Veronica. Can you hear me, Rachel?
Yes,
I can. Hi, nice to sort of see you.
Yeah, I'm here. So amazing talk. Thank you. And I was fascinated by the Duncanson painting, which I had not seen before. And as a curator, I'm dying to know whose collection that is in, but I'm not going to ask that.
I don't know. I've been dying myself, and I've been trying to figure it out.
Okay.
But I'll let you know when
well,
I do.
let's work on that.
Yeah.
So, and I know maybe our mutual colleague Anna Karabin-Kessin might know. She's done some interesting work on Duncanson. So, but I'm fascinated here, but in this painting, by the conjunction of environmental justice and what we might today call racial justice. I mean, both very presentist ideas. But I'm fascinated by the intersection of a patron who was both an abolitionist and a miner. And of course, in the 19th century, that would not have been seen as a conflict of interest at all. I think, so I'm interested in how the painting could be read in the 19th century, but I'm also interested in thinking today about artistic patronage and museum patronage in particular, because I do have some trustees who are minors, but are also very committed to social justice. So I think that there's this intersection that can be unpacked in this painting, between that discourse of capitalism and environmentalism in the mind and support of abolitionist causes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as you're speaking, I'm formulating a little exhibition that you and I might create.
Yes,
along these lines. But I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that are one of the things I wanted to convey in describing what might happen if we read Humboldt and these paintings against the grain is an opening up so that we can see a landscape like Duncanson's in its sort of in its fullest irony, right? Because of course the operations of the extractive industry then and now are what have led to environmental injustice, which disproportionately affects underrepresented communities and communities of color. And the irony thus lies in the fact that this was a painting commissioned by Avery to support Duncanson, who was a Black artist, and Avery, as an abolitionist, wanted to support his cause. And so I think looking at a landscape like Duncanson's from a presentist point of view helps us, even though the contradiction wouldn't have been necessarily visible to everyone in the period. It helps us to re-see and reread and thicken our understanding of the histories and forces that led to the painting, but also to the social, political, environmental formations of the present day vis-a-vis social and racial justice.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that's a great answer. And it also reminds me of when last year Renee Ader was presenting at our Schuylkill to Hudson Symposium, or 2 years ago now. And we talked about how the landscape of slavery is erased from Hudson River painting. So I think this idea of bringing in our current concepts and unpacking of racial and environmental issues to these paintings will only enrich our discussions in the future. So thank you.
Yeah, that's right. And just to say one quick thing, just because what we can see now in those paintings wasn't seeable necessarily then, although probably it was to certain viewers, including perhaps Duncanson himself, doesn't mean it's not there, right? It doesn't mean we can't in fact find those histories in those pictures.
Thank you.
We have another question here in the question Q&A by Emily Gebhardt. I'm going to open your microphone.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Rachel, for such a fascinating talk and for such great questions. And as you know, I am particularly fascinated by William Trost Richards. I've got a Richards thing going on. And I loved that you showed Old Ocean's Gray and Melancholy Wastes, because I find that such a haunting painting and such a marvelous evocation of the idea of the other than human, the beyond human. And I just would like to hear how you might put that painting in dialogue with what you think Humboldt might have been trying to invite readers and viewers to visualize about the power of the other than human.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because on the face of it, Richard's painting of the ocean and Humboldt's, say, physical tableau are polar opposites, right? One is a picture of absence and nothing, although of course the ocean is teeming with life, but the idea is that the human doesn't have access to it, visual or otherwise. I mean, Rachel Carson is one of the most brilliant and beautiful interlocutors in this regard of the impenetrability of the ocean, but our persistent desire to know it. So, and you know, that Richard's image of nothing versus Humboldt's image of everything. They don't seem as if they are necessarily in conversation, but I think they are, in part because I think that even though Humboldt set out to measure and observe and dissect all bits and parts and aspects of nature, I think he ultimately, and he spoke at length about this in his writings. I mean, we have a sense of Humboldt as this self-confident, hubristic, ever optimistic scientist who down into nature and figured it all out, but his writing is shot through with doubt and an articulation of the difficulty of doing what he set out to do. And he spends page after page talking about just how hard it is to make nature present in an image, and that ultimately it might be an impossible task. And so I think there, in the same way that I would argue in Darwin's diagram, there is a threading through of doubt. I actually think that Humboldt purposefully incorporated a certain form of obscurity or impossibility in his pictures, because I think there was a way in which he felt himself humbled by nature, and ultimately thought that nature's was so magnificent, partly because it wouldn't let the human fully in. So there's a way in which the opacity of the physical tableau is very much akin to the opacity of the Richards.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rachel. I don't have any other questions here, but I was going to just ask you something, or maybe just more of a comment. And it's this how interesting it is that I found the relationship, for example, between the Homer Dodge Martin, the Humboldt tableau, the Caldas tableau or drawing, the Chris Jordan, and it's this effect of trying to understand what is inside, where the only way to understand it is finally kind of to open it, right? To open what is hidden. And how this manages to be done in these issues of image and synthesis, also an abstraction, and how mining is what is that is underground and cannot be seen. But then in the photograph, in the Chris Jordan photograph, for example, the only way to be seen is to open up the bird, right? And it's just kind of really visceral. It's the opening of the bird, or even the opening of the mountain, the way Humboldt is doing it. And so all of these relationships are so interesting. And I've always found when I've read your material or heard you speak, this kind of frustration that Humboldt had with trying to capture this everything, right? How do you capture the whole universe into this one image? And then you have these more explicit images where the only way of showing is just kind of opening up, right? So it was just that. I just found it fascinating, the relationship between these.
Yeah, that's, I'm not going to pull it up again, but there's a section of the physical tableau beneath the mountain slope filled with plant names that's basically a pink strip, and Humboldt labels it the region of some subterranean plants. And he's seen a few of the plants that live underground, because he by that time was in a lot of mines, but most of the subterranean was unavailable to people. People hadn't dug sewers and subway systems yet. That would come later in the 19th century. And the second chapter of this book I'm writing is actually called The Subterranean, and it hits on some of the very things you've just described. But I have to say, Veronica, what you said about the opening up of the bird carcass, I hadn't thought of that at all. That's absolutely brilliant. I think that says a lot about the strategies and the grapplings that all image makers, the strategies by which all image makers grapple with showing what is there and what
obscene, right? In terms of the more than the scene, right? In the other ones, it's kind of implied that in the mining there's things below, in the ocean there's things below, but then with the bird it's just like this obscene in terms of the reference. Thank you.
That's great.
So we have a question. I will, Kenneth Myers with your hand up, and then Rachael Ciampioli, I will give you, let me see, Kenneth. I need to find you. Oh, sorry, I can't see you here.
Here, I think
I can't open Kenneth Meyer's microphone. I mean, I can
Actually,
open oh,
Did
there
I just,
you go.
have you
There
heard
you
me
go.
now?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
I-
the
I
problem
think I
may have
just
been that
did
I'm
it.
a panelist, so I may have been someplace else.
Ah,
You had
okay,
it already
okay.
open. I
Yeah,
didn't realize I
Of
could
course,
unmute
of
myself.
course,
Hi,
you're in
Rach.
the panelist section, of course. Thank you.
Nice talk. I guess to go back to the Richards, and I may have misheard, but it seemed to me that at times you were describing the subject of the painting as an image of nothing, and a couple of times, and sometimes as an image of the unbuilt, and I think, or the untouched, and I think that's a distinction that's worth keeping. I mean, I think, I know early Richards, I've thought more about early Richards than paintings from the 1880s, but it seems to me he's one of those artists who's deeply committed to wanting to think that he can represent nature apart from his subjectivity, or he wants to minimize subjectivity as much. So I think that's very much, I think the draw to him of the ocean, even without the beach, is thinking that he can create a truthful representation of nature as it exists apart from subjectivity and apart from anything human. You and I are on the same page thinking that that's not possible, but I think he's still at a moment. So for him, I don't think that's an image of nothingness. I think that's an image of the world as it exists apart from individual subjectivity.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there's a putative opacity, but that putative opacity is actually a gesture towards the fact that there's this massive and teeming world beyond the human reach. So it's a picture that offers up nothing maybe to the human, but contains within it multitudes.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Sorry.
Hi, Professor DeLue. Thank you so much for your time and your energy this morning, and a wonderful presentation. And I'm piggybacking a bit on the earlier question from Anna, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to Humboldt's relationship with indigenous or native guides in the area, and kind of how those ways of thinking and perspectives on the land come together in his work, and just their relationship and how it's reflected. Because I've been thinking, through the landscapes that you've shown about the indigenous land that's being shown and the erasure of native peoples in those contexts. So
Yeah. And I think, what you just said in a sense sums it up in a nutshell. Humboldt what regularly interacted with and engaged and relied on in indigenous informants and peoples and communities. And he regularly cites this in his writing, both published and unpublished. And there's some extended meditations on his part about different nomenclatures. So what an indigenous culture might call a specific rock formation or physical feature in the landscape. But he never, this is what makes Humboldt, a man of his moment, in the sense that he was not just complicit in, but participatory and advanced the colonialist project. He never sees that indigenous knowledge or the name that a culture might give to a place, even though he's interested in it. And he has these copious footnotes and passages about these things. He never sees that as an alternative to his knowledge, what he will go on to claim about the thing or or the idea. And I think this reflects, I mean, Humboldt, and this is, what I'm about to say is going to sound a bit like an apology for Humboldt, but it's not. It's not, because I mean, Humboldt contributed to the decimation of vast terrains and populations in the Americas. But as a man of his time, and again, I choose my words really carefully, he was far more, let's say, advanced in his thinking about formations like slavery and decimations of indigenous populations. Now, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? You can't decimate those populations and then claim yourself sort of wokely victorious because you didn't like what happened. But he was active in his work, not so much in promoting indigenous ways of seeing, but in disrupting the idea that European civilization was the only model and that there weren't other models of civilization out there. So what he did acknowledge, and there was a debate at the time, or a sort of party line in European science at the time that saw European civilization as kind of the apex, right? And that cultures elsewhere in the world as the sort of beginning stages of those civilizations. And what Humboldt said was, no, they're just different. They're just different civilizations. So he wanted to disrupt the kind of narrative of progress from from savage to civilization. But in terms of the knowledge he produced and what he understood to be the scientific, that that alternative or other civilization and indigenous knowledge didn't really play a role.
Thank you.
So we have one last comment in our Q&A chat, and Amy Kurtz just comments, the reference to mines, miners, and sewers make me think of the extensive discussion of these subjects in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables in 1862, something to consult perhaps.
Yeah. So this is great, and I'm going to have to revisit that. But the subterranean imaginary, or the underground imaginary, was massively rich and widespread in the 19th century, especially in the second half of the 19th century, when sewer systems and sanitation systems were dug in European and subway systems were begun to be dug in European and other cities. And so there's a way in which Humboldt, who was building on a long-standing tradition of theorization about the subterranean and the core of the earth, which dates back to classical Greek and Roman writing. Humboldt, in a way, was the sort of frontline edge of what became this massive fascination in the second half of the 19th century with the subterranean. And Victor Hugo is right in there, absolutely.
Rachel, thank you. Thank you so much. We have one last comment, Ramey Mies in the chat. Thank you for this compelling lecture, Professor DeLue. And thanks also to Rachael Ciampioli for asking this important question about the role of Indigenous peoples in Humboldt's environmental thinking. I completely agree. This has been a fantastic opening space. I think we're all very much inspired to continue all of these discussions in our panels. Thank you, Dr. DeLue. I'm really, again, I'm sorry that you're not here. We were going to go and see Humboldt. We were going to go and see Caldas at the National Museum. We were going to do all of these wonderful things. Let's hope that we can revisit those ideas in a not too far away future. This is a great opening. Thank you also for all of our participants and their questions. And so I invite everyone to take a half-hour break. And we'll be back for our first panel at 11 a.m. GMT -5. This is Bogotá time. Thank you again. Yes, this has been amazing, and well, we're connected. So we had 128 people here from many places, which is also, again, one of those plus things.
Yes. Thank you, Veronica, and thank you for all of the questions, which were rich and make me look forward even more to the rest of today and the following sessions in the coming weeks.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in half an hour.
My name is Próspero Carbonell, and I will be the moderator of the first panel titled Plantations. Before we start, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please use the question and answer option that's in below the below buttons, and the panelists will address them at the end of the three discussions. As I mentioned, this panel is titled Plantations, and we will have the lectures from Kenneth Myers, the doctor from the Detroit Institute of Arts, with his lecture Tanning Deforestation, Reforestation, and the Early History of Landscape Painting in the United States, 1825 to 1855. And we will end with Rachael Stevens' lecture from the University of Alabama, Plantation Plantings in Cuba and the US South, National Identity versus Slavery Justification. With Dr. Kenneth Myers' lecture, remember that all of the questions will be answered at the end. Dr. Kenneth Myers comes from the Detroit Institute of Arts. He's the current curator of American art and head department of American art from the Detroit Institute of Arts. He received his English major from the Cornell University and an MA and MPhil from of American Studies program at the Yale University. In 1990, he received a PhD, also from American Studies program at Yale. Among his select publications, he's been also a curator of American art and head department of the American art of the Detroit Institute of Arts and associate curator of American art at the Freer Gallery. Among his publications, the book Friedrich Church, A Painter's Pilgrimage, also Mr. Witzel's Gallery, pictures at an 1884 exhibition, and the Catskills Painters, that has to do with this lecture, Writers and Tourists in the Mountains. We can begin.
Thank you, Próspero. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Veronica, and also Luisa, who did a lot to make sure I could get into this and get my paper up and running. Located about 10 miles west of the Hudson River port town of Catskill, the easternmost section of the Catskill Mountains played a crucial role in the initial popularization of landscape writing, tourism, and painting in the United States in the period 1790 to 1865. Until the mid-1840s, almost all of this activity was centered on the small area between Catskill Falls and the eastern edge of the escarpment, a scenically spectacular spot where the Catskill Mountain House, the first influential mountain tourist resort in the United States, opened in 1824. As I suggested in my book, The Catskills, Painters, Writers, and Tourists in the Mountains, one key reason the Eastern Catskills played such an influential role in the early history of landscape appreciation is that they were comparatively accessible from the Hudson River, and therefore New York City, at a time when the Hudson was by far the most important transportation corridor in the United States, and New York was rapidly consolidating its position as the financial, commercial, and cultural capital of the nation. In my talk today, I will build on my earlier study by suggesting that the development of the Eastern Catskills as an important destination for tourists, including writers and artists, was both facilitated and constrained by the contemporaneous development of the same general area as an internationally significant center for the production of heavy leather, known as sole leather, which was used to make bridles, harnesses, industrial belting, shoes, and other crucial commodities. Until 1790, almost all sole leather produced in the United States was made in local tanneries operated by single proprietors who procured raw skins and hides locally, employed no more than 5 or 6 workers, and sold or bartered their finished products with local consumers. The processing of thick hide into sole leather typically took about 2 years at this point in time. After being soaked, scraped, and cleaned in order to remove the epidermis and fibrous proteins, hides were soaked in a series of tannic-rich baths. Tannin for these baths was procured by grinding tree bark. Bark from different species of trees was used, but towards the end of the 18th century, New England tanners began to experiment with the bark of the eastern hemlock, which was unusually rich in tannin. Eastern hemlocks grow best in cool, humid climates. In the northeastern United States, they are most often found in mountainous regions at elevations between 2,000 and 6,000 feet above sea level. Production of 1 pound of finished sole leather typically required about 2 pounds of bark, again during this early period. Most of those early tanneries processed no more than 200 or 300 hides a year. None processed more than 1,000 or 2,000. The first large industrial style sole leather tanneries in the United States were constructed in or near urban centers where greater population density facilitated both the procurement of large numbers of fresh hides and the sale of greater amounts of finished sole leather. But by the end of the American Revolution, demand for sole leather had outstripped the local supply of hides. And in New York, tanners began to import dried hides from around the world, most procured from Central and South America, especially Brazil and Argentina. Increased demand for leather encouraged workflow and technological innovations, including the introduction of furnaces to heat the tanning liquids, which speeded up the tanning process, and the development of water-powered equipment, which reduced the labor involved in preparing the dried hides, grinding bark, and emptying and replenishing the tanning baths. As the scale of production increased, the absence of reliable sources of water and water power in urban areas encouraged the relocation of the large tanneries to accessible mountainous regions with plentiful supplies of water, water power, and hemlock bark. By the late 1830s, New York City merchants were importing an average of almost 700,000 dried hides a year, about 2/3 of them coming from either Central or South America. The most influential workflow and technological innovations were developed by William Edwards, a grandson of the famous minister Jonathan Edwards. William Edwards opened his first tannery in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1790. Production increased slowly until 1805 or so, by which time he had introduced the first of his labor-saving innovations and had contracted with New York City merchants to provide him with dried hides and to sell his finished leather. By 1815, his Hampshire Leather Company, the first incorporated tannery in the country, probably the first in the world, was operating 5 mid-sized tanneries capable of processing a total of about 20,000 imported hides a year. Prior to the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, the main immigration routes from New England to Western New York State and points further west went through the Hudson River port towns of Albany, Catskill, or Newburgh, New York. In 1805, a group of Catskill businessmen organized the Little Delaware Turnpike, marked on the map, which surmounted the Catskill Escarpment at the future site of the Catskill Mountain House, before heading west towards the village of Delhi on the west branch of the Delaware River. In 1817, Edwards moved his operations from Northampton to the headquarters of the Schoharie Creek in Hunter, New York. The new tannery was located on the Little Delaware Turnpike, about 6 miles west of the spot where the Catskill Mountain House would be opened 7 years later. In 1824, Edwards and his partners organized the improvement of the previously primitive road through Catskill Clove, which enabled them to receive and ship goods through the Hudson River port of Malden, which was 15 miles from the tannery, rather than the town of Catskill, which was 20 miles away, significantly reducing the cost of both receiving dried hides and shipping finished leather. In 1790, when Edwards opened his first tannery in Northampton, he had spent 12 cents for every pound of leather he produced. By 1830, when his Hudson tannery was in full operation, he was processing an average of 20,000 hides a year and had reduced the cost of production to 4 cents per pound. Where Edwards led, other tanners quickly followed. In 1820, Jonathan Palin opened a substantial tannery at the base of at the entrance to Catskill Clove. And in my photograph, you can see up on the hill, the Catskill Mountain House, which would have opened 5 or 6 years before this drawing was made. 5 or 6 years after the tannery was opened, but 5 or 6 years before the production was drawing. A few years later, a tanner named Williamson took advantage of the newly improved road through the Clove to open a tannery in the Clove itself, just east of where the water from Catterskill Falls flows into Catterskill Creek. In 1825, Zadock Pratt opened an even larger fat tannery on Schoharie Creek, about 20 miles downstream from the sorry, I lost the sentence. A few years later, back to this is still the Palinville Tannery, where Edwards had led, other tanners quickly followed. In 1820, Jonathan Palin opened a substantial tannery at the entrance to Catterskill Clove. As Dan Peck recently pointed out, the smoke from the Palinville Tannery is visible in many of Cole's paintings of the Catskills, as seen from the village of Catskill, as you can see in this 1827 painting. A few years later, a tanner named Williamson took advantage of the newly improved road through the Clove to open a tannery in the Clove itself, just east of where the waters from Catterskill Falls flows into Catterskill Creek. In 1825, Zadock Pratt opened a much larger tannery on Schoharie Creek, about 20 miles downstream from the Edwards Tannery. By 1841, the Prattsville Tannery was processing more than 30,000 hides a year and had leapfrogged Edwards's tannery to become the largest and most financially successful tannery in the nation. Large tanneries like those operated by Edwards and Pratt typically harvested between 600 and 1,000 acres of hemlock forest every year. Over a 20-year period, which was the typical lifespan of one of these large tanneries, an operation would cut all the accessible hemlock within a 10 or 15 mile radius of their tannery. By 1840, the United States was producing more sole leather than any other country in the world. New York State was producing more than any other state in the nation. And Greene County, home to all the Catterskill Schoharie tanneries, was producing more than any other county in the state. According to the US 1850 census, the domestic tanning industry was the 5th or 6th leading industry in the nation when ranked according to the number of establishments, the number of workers employed, the amount of capital invested, or the amount of value added. Catterskill Clove tanneries closed when they had exhausted accessible sources of hemlock, at which time the tanneries relocated further west, first to the Western Catskills, later to the Poconos and Alleghenies, or north to the Adirondacks. The first local tannery to close was the East Hunter Tannery in the Clove, which ceased production in the late 1840s, probably in 1847 or 1848. The Edwards Tannery in Hunter closed by the early 1850s. The rise and fall of the Catterskill Clove area tanneries shaped the activities of painters and other seekers of the picturesque in two opposed ways. In the early period, up to the late 1840s, the presence of the tanneries discouraged painters and other landscape tourists from venturing south from the mountain house in Catterskill Falls. But as the tanneries began to close, painters and other adventurous travelers began to take advantage of the improved roads and the housing opportunities that the tanneries had created. The first influential painter to take advantage of the new opportunities were Asher B. Durand and his friend John Casselier, who spent several weeks in Palinville in the early fall of 1848, the major fruit of that stay being Durand's Clove-inspired masterwork, Kindred Spirits. Durand returned to the Clove the next year and again in 1850, accompanied by Casselier and Kensett and Christopher Peirce Cranch in 1849, and by Casselier and Cranch in 1850. By then, Sanford Gifford and other younger artists had found their way to a boarding house near the site of the abandoned Clove Tannery, where members of the Brockett family had begun to take in boarders. But it was not until the early 1860s that area leading artists began to cluster in Hunter, near Colonel Edwards' now abandoned tannery. It was there that Durand and Gifford found the inspiration for several of their most important paintings, including Gifford's Gorge in the Mountains, Duran's Catterskill Clove, and Gifford's magisterial Hunter Mountain Twilight. As several scholars have noted, the cut stumps filling the foreground of Hunter Mountain Twilight evoke both the impact on tanning on the local environment and the harvest of human death in then recent images of rotting corpses on Civil War battlefields. And yet, despite the stumps in the foreground and the clear-cut slopes of Hunter Mountain in the distance, Gifford's painting emphasizes the quiet beauty of the scene. Without ignoring the environmental cost of the industrial exploitation of the local environment, Gifford's painting holds out the promise of future natural and national regeneration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Myers. That was a fascinating talk as well. And now we're going to continue with our third and final panelist of this session. Her name is Rachael Stevens. She comes from the University of Alabama. Her lecture is titled Plantation Paintings in Cuba and the US South, National Identity versus Slavery Justification. She's an associate professor of art history at the University of Alabama, received an art history BA from the Ciudadanía University of the South, then an MA in art history from the Vanderbilt University, and finally a PhD from the University of Iowa. Among her select publications, we want to mention The Selling and Rejection, Rolfe E.W. Earle and the Politics of Portraiture, and Hidden in Plain Sight, Slavery and Suppression in Antebellum American Art. Okay, so we can begin. Excellent.
Thank you, Próspero, and thank you all for being here. Thanks especially to Verónica and Kathy and all of the organizers for what I know was a Herculean pivot to the online program, which is working beautifully, I think. I'm going to zoom out a little bit to look at some plantation paintings from a political and cultural context today, both in the South and in Cuba. So here we go. During the early to mid-19th century, the genre of plantation paintings grew and developed simultaneously in the American South and in Cuba. Paintings and prints of a large landed estates emerged across both locations and presented a plantation mythology, illustrating these enslaved societies as productive, healthy, collaborative, and beautiful places. While similarities can be found between the two regions' paintings, and certain ideas resonate across them, comparing plantation paintings from Cuba and the US South reveals contrasting motivations and political contexts. I argue that while many Southern American paintings of this nature were intended to promote slavery defenders' rhetoric and justify the institution, Cuban plantation landscapes were often intended to bolster anti-separatist, anti-nationalist views, and to encourage expansion and control among the European aristocratic class. However, both regions used artistic representations to fashion a plantation idol. A brief comparison of the Louisiana paintings of Marie Adrienne Persac and the Ingenio works of Edward LaPlante reveals how both regions' works romanticize the plantation system and its tamed landscape, attempted to dehumanize enslaved people, and expose the great extent to which artists were implicated in justifying slavery. Although depictions of the inhabited landscape varied across the century in both locations, Cuban landscape paintings tend to imbue poetic meaning into the natural and created world, offering the Cuban land as a site of beauty and bounty. While American works certainly pursued similar ideas in some cases, paintings associated with Southern plantations tended to highlight the centrality of home and family, often celebrating, as does this painting of Washington's Mount Vernon, the architecture of the so-called big house and the people on the plantation as a family unit. Works from both regions idealized plantation life and avoided depicting violence and hard labor. Because of its central location between South and North America, Havana became known as the most celebrated port in all of the West Indies from as far back as 1611. Cuba's connection with the sugar industry dates even further back to its first sugar mills initiated in 1534. Enslaved people began being transported to Cuba in the first quarter of the 16th century. And over time, the human trafficking across the Atlantic brought more than 1 million enslaved Africans to Cuba, where the trade was legalized until 1867. 85% of enslaved Cubans came during the 19th century, however. Enduring in Cuba for over 3.5 centuries, slavery was finally abolished by royal decree on October 7th, 1886. Plantation economies simultaneously came of age in the Deep South in America and in Cuba. The sugar industry exploded in Cuba after the end of the Haitian Revolution in 1804, as large-scale sugar production transferred away from Haiti and to Cuba, among other places. Similarly, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, patented in 1794, allowed for cotton to be processed at a much faster rate than previously, which encouraged planters to add enormous numbers of enslaved people to Deep South cotton plantations, with exhausted soil in Virginia, equivalently encouraging the exportation of enslaved people from there, and the end of the legalized international slave trade into the US in 1808, plantations in the Deep South swelled, and thousands of enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the Lower South, an idea illustrated in this sketch of a coffle of enslaved people being moved further south by Lewis Miller. In the United States, pro-slavery justification began taking shape in response to abolitionism in the 1830s. Wealthy and powerful planters and politicians developed a whole range of arguments in support of the supposedly beneficial nature of enslavement. These included ideas such as that enslaved people were better cared for by their enslavers than they could care for themselves, that slavery was a familial institution, and that contact with the white race benefited the so-called savage African. The Bible was also used to sanction servitude, as was science. The visual art of the South followed the lead of pro-slavery arguments, characterizing enslavement as a happy and beneficial enterprise. For example, images of the so-called family black and white, as illustrated in this work by Charles Vaughan, appeared across the South in support of these justifications. Even though Cuba was a Spanish colony until 1898, pro-independence currents began to be felt throughout Cuba in the 1830s. Therefore, in Cuba, the fight against slavery was coupled with the struggle for independence from Spain. Afro-Cubans were instrumental in planning and executing Cuba's 3 wars against Spain, and Cuba planters closely followed slavery debates both in Britain and the United States. Worrying that an anti-colonial movement would encourage enslaved people to form their own revolution, the European Cuban elite did not form as large of an anti-colonial movement as might have been expected. As Cuban ideas of independence arose, Spaniards worked to tighten their reign on the island, offering incentives for Spaniards to settle in the colony. European artists were drawn by the flourishing sugar and tobacco operations and intent on capitalizing on their promotion of the European-owned industries. The aristocracy on the island commissioned work that supported established racial hierarchies and represented idealized views of the Cuban landscape, perhaps to entice additional European settlement. These artists began delineating Cuban plantations as agro-industrial complexes. These works were often intended to reflect national Spanish pride and expansionism, and as Alison Fraunhofer summarizes, quote, "The ideological stakes of promoting the plantation were so great, and the costs, human, economic, and environmental, were so enormous that it was crucial to lead those costs in the representation of the plantation." This elision occurred notably in the work of French immigrant artist Edward Laplante. He offered aristocratic plantation owners who commissioned him topographic images of sugar mills, which diminished scenes of work and depictions of enslaved people down to tiny details, and expressed the plantation as a bright and orderly place. Laplante depicted the island's largest sugar mills, or ingenios, located in the Valley of Trinidad, 19th century center of the Cuban sugar industry, focusing on the landscape, the mills themselves, and the mechanization of the process, and not on the humans who toiled on them. In 1857, Laplante published a book of 28 lithographs entitled El Libro de los Ingenios, in order to celebrate these places and encourage development. These works offer idealized, sometimes clinical views of various Cuban ingenios, which work to idealize the mechanization of sugar production on the island. As opposed to American plantation scenes, which often omitted enslaved people altogether, or alternatively celebrated their contentment, many of these lithographs did catalog slavery as practiced in Cuba in great, albeit tiny and orderly detail, and thus must be viewed as allegories of power. And it's hard to see the orderly rows of enslaved people hard at work in these scenes, but they are there, albeit in the tiniest details. For example, in Ingenio Buena Vista, the neo-colonial Casa de Vivienda, or manor house, reigns in majesty, surveillance, and power at the highest point on the landscape over the view that includes mill buildings and barracks for the enslaved. However, the perhaps truly inexpressible notion of terror and violence that occurred in these places are replaced by harmonious views meant to express progress. These idealized views emerged despite the fact that enslaved people who worked on sugar mills were often subjected to the harshest working environments, of course. During the harvest season, the cutting of cane required 20-hour workdays, even though the Spanish Black Code was supposed to limit working hours to from sunrise to sunset. Likewise, communities of self-emancipated and enslaved people that formed in the wild landscapes beyond the plantation, known as cimarrones, as seen in this work by Landaluce, are never referenced in those plantation scenes. Like Laplante, French architectural landscape painter Marie-Adrienne Persac, working in Louisiana, diminished the hard labor of the plantation in his paintings that celebrate order, contentment, and productivity. Persac sometimes peopled his detailed views of some of Louisiana's grandest plantation scenes with very small numbers of enslaved people, but by and large, as this work does, he omitted the enslaved people themselves. The enslaved people that do rarely appear in Persac's work are represented as healthy, well-clothed, and not usually engaged in backbreaking labor, or the toil involved in the actual workday is diminished. Persac's detailed view of the South Louisiana plantation Bois de Flèche represents the big house oriented on the right behind a geometrically plotted vegetable garden in the foreground, dotted with crepe myrtle trees and a road separating the two areas. The remainder of the view behind the garden is remarkably given over to sites of enslavement, although no people are present or working within those. Buildings and equipment associated with planting cotton appear at left, and slave quarters surround the house. The raised frame structure at the far left houses the cotton gin, and a screw press for baling cotton stands to the right. According to family tradition, while he was engaged in painting this scene, planter Francisco DeLue provided Persac an enslaved assistant. And it is intriguing to consider the role this person might have played in introducing Persac to the site and influencing the view. In total, 5 small figures are present in this scene, including a tiny Black woman in the background who feeds chickens, 2 well-dressed white women who stroll in the garden, and an enslaved man with a hoe stands beside another white woman in the foreground. Despite seeming to offer a realistic and highly detailed view of the DeLue estate, the omission of enslaved people was a deliberate choice for Persac in this work and many others. This becomes especially clear considering that 65% of the population in this region were enslaved African Americans. Persac represented white enslavers as superior to enslaved workers, who he reduced to a support mechanism. Even so, in representing the plantation as calm and orderly, Persac's works idealize the American South and its plantation economy as a logical way of life in ways that both mirror and refract Laplante's Cuban scenes. Although the Cuban works were intended to help maintain racial hierarchy and entice Spanish immigration and thus control on the island, the Cuban artist's works are today ironically celebrated for their recording of a nationalistic Cuban trend. Likewise, antebellum American plantation scenes are still often held up as icons of a golden age. They also inspired even more deeply romanticized plantation views later into the Jim Crow era, a period of deep racialized violence. Despite these collective idealizations, I believe we must work to acknowledge and remember plantations for what they truly were, which is money-driven sites of forced labor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Fascinating lecture as well, and lots of resonances with the first lecture. I couldn't help but notice. Now we're going to go to our questions and answer section, but before we go there, for all of the attendees, there's going to be a poll. So if you can answer that poll while we answer the questions. Remember that you can write them down, or you can raise your hand and we can activate your microphone. Next, we have a question from Lauren Tate, directed to Rachel. She says, Rachel, I see some similarity to William Aiken Walker's plantation paintings, though I believe he was strictly working in the South. I'm wondering now if he would have been familiar or influenced by Cuban plantation painting. Did you come across Walker in your research? And thanks.
Thank you for that question. That's so insightful of you, because I don't know how many of you are aware that Walker did travel to Cuba for 3 months. So William Aiken Walker did work almost exclusively in the South, but he came of age after the Civil War. So his are, postbellum images from the perspective of someone I see as kind of one of those unreconstructed Confederates who's producing these, quasi-nostalgic, quasi-mythical works that align with the developing Lost Cause movement in the years after the war. And his work is appealing specifically to tourists. So it definitely falls in line and falls along this trajectory. But it is a little later than what I'm talking about, but you have to think that he is certainly influenced by what he encountered in Cuba. And there are, I haven't dug into his journal that he did in Cuba and the sketches that he did there, but it was a very productive 3-month period. I believe in 1870 is when he went. So those could create some really interesting resonances if I start to move my timeline post-war. But Walker is so prolific and so fascinating and so single-mindedly committed to the South that would be an interesting sort of thread to pull a little bit, I think. Thanks for the question.
Excellent. And there's also in the chat a question for you, Rachel, that says, Rachel, what do you make of the interaction between the slave and the white woman in the foreground of the Persats, Bois de la Flèche?
Oh, thank you for that question too. It's hard to get at those figures in the Persac images because, as many of you probably know, a lot of Persac's images, I don't know if he was uncomfortable in painting the figure, it was easier for him to cut and paste figures that he found in magazines onto those, but it's hard to read like artist intentionality and even patron intentionality into those because they weren't figures he created oftentimes. Although he certainly collected them and selected them and was working for patrons who commissioned them. And so I think we can read a little bit there. He certainly purposely chose to put those two figures beside each other to picture the woman larger than the enslaved man, to depict the woman in traditionally elite, planter elite attire, and the enslaved worker as a worker. So can we read that as a way of marking those established hierarchies of power and race in the South at the time? I think probably, but it's hard to. I wish I could get more closely at patrons, artists' interaction in the South in the antebellum period, and it's just a really hard thing to kind of parse.
Yes. And we have another question directed to Kenneth Myers. It says, thank you all for these excellent presentations. I have a question for Kenneth that builds on Rachel's question earlier this morning. Could you speak to the persistent erasure of Native Americans in these Catskill paintings? I am also interested in the variations between settler approaches to tanning in a capitalist framework as they contrast with tanning processes practiced by indigenous communities in this region and elsewhere, which might be an interesting future comparison.
It is. Both indigenous patterns of tanning and the smaller scale that had been produced by Euro-American tanners from the 17th century on. Both those, I mean, the indigenous populations had been pretty decimated by the early 19th century in the region. They're there, they show up visually in the record. Actually, the most earliest painted representation of the Catskills from the Hudson Valley is a painting from the 1740s, which shows both enslaved Africans and probably enslaved Native Americans in the foreground. It's an estate portrait rather similar to the kind of estate portraits of Cuba and Brazil that we've been looking at. That tradition drops out and the figures drop out. I can't think of any African-American representation in the dominant landscape traditions. And they're, in thinking about the way you all talked about the figures in the plantation portraits from Brazil and Cuba, it is interesting that there are no figures in that lithograph I showed of Prattsville, which is the only image like that I've seen. The image I showed of the Hunter Tannery is frustrating. I know a well-known painter, Daniel Huntington, painted a view of that tannery very early in his career. That painting, the one I showed, was a reproduction of a copy. It's described where I found it as a photograph of a copy of a painting, and they don't tell us who the painter was. And I've often wondered whether that might not be the really early Daniel Huntington, but I don't know. And there's no figures in that painting either. It was another question. There were two questions. It was double loaded. It was the image. Oh, and the image of Native Americans. It's interesting to me that they, in Cole's paintings of the Catskills, they are used as staffage, indicating, I think, harking back to Rachel's paper, that this is an image they're standing for, that what's being represented is a putatively untouched environment, and they become a marker of the naturalness of the natural scene. That tradition, the last major painting to evoke that kind of objectification and symbolic use of indigenous figures that I can think of is a Kensett painting that I don't think I showed of Catterskill Falls. It's one of the paintings that comes out of his first experience of the Clove in 1849 and 1850. And it exists both as a major painting and as some related oil studies and an engraving where the Indians, Native Americans function the same way they had in the Cole paintings.
Excellent. We have so many questions and so little time, but there's one last question that's directed to Rachel. She says, what do we know about the international circulation of plantation paintings? Were the views painted by Persac, for instance, seen outside Louisiana or the American South?
Okay, thank you for that. There are so many questions I was trying to write.
I know.
And think about all these wonderful ideas that everyone in the audience has. I don't know about Persac. I don't think they were widely circulated. They are certainly beloved in Louisiana in their time and now, but it seems like they were commissioned by plantation owners for their own homes. And of course, the plantation home at that time is a public space, and these were certainly points of pride and make intentional statements in the period. But beyond Persac, of course, there was circulation of lots of pro-slavery justification along the same lines of the messages of these images across the South, particularly in prints. And if we jump to Cuba with those La Plante images, they were oil on canvas paintings in those manor houses, but then reproduced in lithographs. And it's unknown how many copies of those lithographic books were printed, as low as 28, as many as much more than that. But that speaks to a certain level of circulation as well. So when we get at reception, I have to think that these were things that were more well-known beyond just the independent individual plantation.
Excellent. I'm afraid that we're short on time, even though we have more questions to go, but I would inspire you to search for the panelists and keep on asking the questions, because this is very interesting and always enriching, and it's always rewarding to see so many questions at the end of a panel. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. We have a 10-minute break, if I'm not wrong, and then we continue with our second panel. So much.
Próspero, I think we don't have a break actually. I think we can just continue directly.
Right, I'm sorry, I thought it was 11.
Otherwise, we'll have people up north very, very hungry at lunchtime, etc. So I think we can go on to our next session. Thank you, Próspero, and thank you everyone, and tons of questions. This was kind of unbelievable. Thank you.
Hi, Veronica. How are you? Good morning.
Hello, Natalia. Good morning.
Good morning.
I just want to check that everyone from the second session, from the second panel is here. Is Maria Beatriz, Rami, Caroline, and Matthew already here with me?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Caroline, okay.
I'm here.
I don't see Matthew or Rami. Are you guys? Okay, no.
Hi, I'm here.
Rami, hi. Okay, and I'm just missing Matthew. Maybe.
There you go. He's there.
Yes. Okay, well, in that case, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to open the second session, the second panel, which is Imprints of African Slaves and Indigenous Peoples. And our first panelist is Maria Beatriz Carrion. Maria Beatriz is doing her PhD in History of Art in the City University of New York. She did her MA in Tulane, and some of her main publications are the Mexican Angelos Novice, a popular cultural archive and historiography from 2017, and The Boundaries of Race, The Boundaries of Representation in Athenor in 2018. Her paper for this panel is Pits, Mounds, Scaffolds, Burying and Unearthing Indigenous Bodies in the US Landscape. Welcome, Maria Beatriz.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and also for the invitation to participate in this event. I'm gonna try to share my screen. Let's see. Can people see the screen? Is it working fine?
I can see it, yes.
Yes, perfect, thank you. Okay, so before starting this presentation, I want to respectfully acknowledge that today I am speaking from the homeland of the Creek Confederacy. Indigenous peoples from other Native nations also reside in Georgia and have made innumerable contributions to the region. Okay, so in 1881, the US Bureau of Ethnology published its first annual report to the Smithsonian Institution. The document included an extensive section on the mortuary customs of, and I quote here, North American Indians, authored by the naturalist H.C. Yarrow. This text describes practices that range from cremation to tree and scaffold burials. Lavish illustrations by lithographer Thomas Sinclair and painter Henry Farney, among others, complement this essay. Despite circulating among specialized Euro-American audiences and representing a Eurocentric perspective, these images incidentally demonstrate the cultural relationships binding indigenous peoples to the North American landscape. In fact, the images demonstrate that land and other natural elements, such as rivers and shores, are an integral element of native funerary practices and portray indigenous figures as agents who reside on and transform the land through their traditional cultural practices. The colonialist rhetoric surrounding the production and circulation of these images comes to the surface when considering that the Smithsonian's interest in indigenous mortuary practices coincided with the systematic unearthing of Native American bodies for pseudoscientific study in the 1870s and 1880s, when craniology and phrenology were popular fields of study. The most notable visual product of these digs for human remains is the series of photographs produced by the US Army Medical Museum depicting skulls not only of Ute, Pueblo, Choptank, Dakota, and Inuit subjects, but also of African American, Peruvian, Filipino, Hawaiian, and Taiwanese individuals. Treating human remains as objects of scientific study, particularly when this practice is more often applied to non-European and non-Euro-American bodies, has contributed to the objectification and dehumanization of indigenous peoples and to the sacralization of massive burial sites under the guise of anthropology and archaeology. In addition to being the subject of photographic representation, indigenous human remains were also displayed in anthropological and natural history museums, often presented as curiosities that portrayed indigenous peoples as part of a long-lost past rather than enslaving present communities. The pervasiveness of this practice of unearthing indigenous bodies from burial sites and exhibiting them in institutional contexts gave rise to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, which provides guidelines for the respectful return of human remains of indigenous Americans to their respective communities. The treatment of Native American human remains has in fact become both a prominent issue of cultural law in the United States and also priority for the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, which among other institutions has made a concerted effort to repatriate human remains and develop guidelines for the preservation and study of culturally sensitive materials. Considering the prevalence that this issue holds in Native American and indigenous studies, as well as in contemporary debates regarding indigenous sovereignty and human rights, this has forced me to reconsider the ethical implications of speaking and writing about mortuary images produced by Euro-American artists and anthropologists. In the time that has passed between the writing of the abstract for this presentation and the development of my paper, I've had the opportunity to familiarize myself with the protocols, guidelines, and scholarship on the treatment of culturally sensitive materials and learned about best research practices to engage with this genre of visual culture. As a result, rather than presenting a more conventional or historical essay today on the images that were published by the US Bureau of Ethnology in 1981, I have instead prepared a two-part presentation that opens with a reflection on the ethics of our historical research on culturally sensitive materials and concludes with an analysis of how these images can serve to deconstruct assumptions about indigenous people's relationship to and with the landscape. So I'm going to start by talking about our historical research on culturally sensitive materials. So the protocols for Native American archival materials were developed in 2006 by a group of Native and non-Native archival specialists who represented 15 different Native American, First Nation, and Aboriginal communities. The protocols, which were made available to the public in 2007 and are open access and digitally available, address best practices not only at an institutional level, but also in smaller scale contexts, particularly highlighting the importance of consulting tribal communities when working with materials of suspicious or illicit provenance, delicate subject matter, or even those of fictional nature. According to the protocols, culturally sensitive materials include objects that range from recordings and transcripts of music and oral histories to cartographic and religious materials and still and moving images depicting human remains, ceremonies, burials, and funerals. This list is not comprehensive and presents a general overview of the issue, as determining whether an object is culturally sensitive depends on the context of its creation, and this can vary from one indigenous community to another. The protocols also describe that, and I quote, for Native American communities, the public release of or access to specialized information or knowledge gathered with and without informed consent can cause irreparable harm. Considering that visual representations of burials and funerary practices are generally considered culturally sensitive according to these protocols, and the fact that the US Bureau of Ethnology did not explicitly indicate the affiliation of the individuals depicted in each image, I have opted to treat the entirety of the materials as culturally sensitive for the purpose of this paper. Making this choice entails that I cannot fully share these images in this presentation until I am able to identify the communities portrayed by the images, confirm the accuracy of their depiction of indigenous funerary practices, foreground the historical context of our visual analysis, and receive clearance to circulate these materials in academic scenarios. However, anyone can access these images in the various digital repositories that feature them, including the Gutenberg Project and the digital collections of the New York Public Library, which, unlike institutions that have large holdings of Native American materials, such as the Newberry Library, have not developed specific guidelines to determine researchers' handling of culturally sensitive images, which facilitates ethical research on such documents. In a field as image-centric as art history, making the choice to follow the protocols implies a need to develop alternative ways of studying these images. How can we as art historians study culturally sensitive materials without infringing on indigenous sovereignty and human rights? Is it possible to engage with these images without re-victimizing or further stereotyping or misportraying indigenous communities? And how can we possibly write art history without images? An example of an ethically sound and effective way of critically displaying images of violence and death is the work of contemporary artist Ken Gonzalez-Day, who has worked on images of lynching in California with a focus on hate crimes committed against Latino, Native American, and Asian populations. Gonzalez-Day's work intervenes in this graphic and racist visual culture by removing the victimized bodies from the images through Photoshop. According to the artist, his erased lynching series, rather than re-victimizing those murdered in such collective and often premeditated acts of killing, allows the viewer to literally focus on the crowd and hopes to promote a critical exploration of American history. Inspired by Gonzalez-Day's treatment of sensitive materials, the images that I will share with you today are strategically blurred. Finally, rather than treating the images as documents or records of Native American practices, my analysis will consider them as fictional, artificial representations that nevertheless can help us understand the ways in which these materials convey Native American communities' relationship with the North American landscape. So before I talk about these images, I wanted to include this phrase by Gabriel Garcia Marquez from his book, Cien Años de Soledad, because I think that this phrase, when I first read the book, really made an impression on me. And I think that this is something that I kept in mind when I chose to write this paper. And this epigraph reads, Uno no es de ninguna parte mientras no tenga un muerto bajo la tierra, or in English, a person does not belong to a place until there is someone dead under the ground. So the depiction of a Lakota scaffold burial is one of the most compelling images included in the report. Here, a seemingly fragile scaffold built of slim wooden sticks stands alone in an empty field. A body rests peacefully on top of the scaffold. The simplicity of this construction and the minimalism of the image's composition have the paradoxical effect of establishing the scaffold as a marker of place and presence in the landscape. Rather than being subsumed by landforms in the background or the extensiveness of the field, the scaffold redefines the natural space without physically transforming or depleting it. But this construction is ephemeral. It seems to be a timeless component of the view that memorializes the human presence in the territory without creating a binary divide between nature and culture, but rather a unity between these elements. In archaeological terms, the dynamics between and among the scaffold, the natural field, and the implicit activity of the people who build this ephemeral site would be labeled as a funerary landscape and a cultural landscape, which both UNESCO and the Cultural Landscape Foundation define as sites that provide a sense of place and identity as they map our relationship with the land over time, and they are part of our national heritage and each of our lives. This image, despite its Eurocentrism and historical roots in settler colonialism, recognizes that this land has been occupied by the Dakota and plays a fundamental role in the ways in which this community memorializes the death. The significance of recognizing Native American people's cultural intervention in the land is that it negates the notion mobilized in the 19th century about Indigenous people's absence from the territory and inability to modify it. As Rachael Saylor has argued in her book, Meaningful Places, the portrayal of the colonized areas in the American West as empty and available spaces facilitated the occupation of the territory because it did not add historical or spiritual value to it. Against the tradition of pioneer photography described by Saylor, this image recognizes and even asserts the presence of Dakota people on the land, imbuing this unnamed, almost generic natural setting with an emotional and memorial dimension, highlighting the community's sense of belonging in the landscape. The image of several Inuit lodge burials in an expansive area has a similar effect, accidentally bringing attention to how these small-scale but numerous interventions in the cold and large field express the presence and traditions of the communities who said goodbye to these bodies. Unlike craniological studies that reduce human remains to anatomical terms and quantitative information, this imagery reminds viewers of the humanity behind those remains. Similarly, stronger, more occupational funerary practices such as burial trees and depictions of cremation and mourning capture the relationship even more explicitly between the landscape and the fundamental cultural practices of remembering and respecting the dead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Beatriz.
Yes, I'm going to stop sharing in a second.
Okay, no, that's fine. So our next panelist is Caroline. Caroline, welcome. Caroline is, she did her PhD in art history in Rice University in Houston, and her dissertation was in migrant construction and Maya monuments, transnational art and architecture in modern Argentina in 1910 to 1955. And she's currently working at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga as an assistant professor in art history. Her lecture today is on picturing West African Muslims in the 19th century Brazilian landscape, male representations in transatlantic visual culture and architecture. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me here, and a special thank you to the organizers of this exciting event and pivoting in these circumstances, as well as all the panelists today. It's been a very enriching dialogue of papers, and so I'm very excited for our Q&A. And everyone can see my screen well and hear me well, hopefully.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, I would just like to begin by saying, again, I'm Caroline Olivia Wolf. I'm coming to you from Chattanooga, which I would like to acknowledge as the traditional territory of the Tusalagi peoples, which is now known as the Eastern Band of Cherokee and the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, as well as the Tosoyaha people, also known as the Muskogee Creek. So we have actually some various connections actually in terms of landscapes and indigenous homelands happening here today across the papers. And I want to acknowledge the history of forced removal and genocide upon this territory from which I'm zooming into you from, and just honor and respect those diverse indigenous communities still connected to this land. So today I'm presenting my paper, Picturing West African Muslims in the 19th Century Brazilian Landscape, Malay Representations in Transatlantic Visual Culture and Architecture. So West African Muslim slaves, known as Malays, played a critical role in the socio-political landscape of 19th century Brazil, and were particularly known for mobilizing several slave rebellions, including the largest resistance effort in the Americas, the 1835 Malay Revolt of Bahia. Malays left an important mark on the Brazilian visual culture and were depicted in various forms over the century. While print representations of Malays were influenced by ethnographic genres, as we will see, Malay descendants crafted their own images of collective identity via dress, as well as talismanic amulets and architectural forms constructed upon their return to West Africa. So this paper traces 19th century representations constructed of and by Malay Muslims from Brazil to Benin via transatlantic perspective. Scholars have estimated that West African Muslims comprise more than 1 million of the estimated 12 million African people whom were enslaved by Europeans and white Americans in North America, South America, and the Caribbean islands via the transatlantic slave trade. And two broad West African coastal regions from which Muslims are believed to have primarily arrived were Upper Guinea and the Bight of Benin. Sylviane Diouf has shown that these Muslims form part of an elite group of educated and literate jurists, Quranic teachers, statesmen, merchants, and traveling scholars who lectured in Jenne and Timbuktu. Though disparate in terms of geographic roots and local dialects, West African ethnic groups that shared the Islamic faith and use of Arabic included the Yoruba, Fulani, Mandingo, Wolof, Vai, and Hausa, among others. Prints of West African Muslims produced in Africa and circulated in Europe provide a lens for examining similar depictions created in the Americas. A key example is the illustrated text by French doctor and explorer Jean-Claude Geoffroy de Villeneuve, titled Africa or the History of Manners, Uses and Customs of Africans in Senegal from 1814. The author lived in Senegal for about 2 years, where the images were said to have been produced from drawings created on the spot. This image here, captioned Talbe, a Moor priest or marabout, illustrates a Muslim learned man, teacher, spiritual diviner, or cleric. Shown in a contemplative pose, the marabout wears a head wrap and various Islamic talismans. Such talismans date back to the 11th century in Islamic tradition and typically consist of a folded paper containing Quranic verse or protective designs sewn into a leather pouch and worn around the neck, arm, pockets, and even under headdresses, offering the wearer protection. While the Muslim cleric holds a long-stemmed pipe, behind him, men are depicted in prayer for prostration in loose coverings known as bubu, traditionally worn in West Africa. Though colorful secular variations have been adopted of this garment, white bubus are especially associated with those who have made the pilgrimage to Mecca or Hajj and thereby connote prestige and piety. This second figure here, whose origin is denoted as from West African or in the Upper Niger Valley, wears a waist wrap, sandals, and similar talismanic amulets. And we can again see that in these strings here. The figure also wears a white skull cap and a striped cloth over his shoulder. This homespun country cloth often featured one of several colors, such as indigo in linear patterns. These garments of both figures signal Muslim identities, marking the wearer as members of the Ummah, or the community of the faithful bound together by Islam. In the 19th century Americas, West African Muslims were similarly rendered in works by Jean-Baptiste Debray, a French-born artist who spent approximately 15 years in Brazil. Debray arrived in the country in 1816 after Napoleon's fall, where he served as a painter to the transplanted court of the Portuguese king, Dom João VI, and founded the Brazilian Academy of the Arts. He produced his own illustrated text based on his journeys from 1827 to 1828, and published these in his multi-volume Voyage pittoresque et historique au Brésil after his return to France in 1834. Two images from volume 2 are frequently referenced by scholars as depicting African Muslims in Brazil. Plate 17, which we see here, captioned the Palmito Cellar, and plate 46, labeled the Black Surgeon, which we'll look at momentarily. Both images reveal particular perceptions associated with West African Muslims in 19th century Brazil. The palmito, or heart of palm cellar, is represented here as a young man with a distinctive head covering walking determinedly through the tropical landscape. The figure's waist wrap and folded cloth shawl echo the garments in de Villeneuve's publication. He appears unburdened by the bundle of palmito trunks, and although a basket seller crosses his path, the figures do not interact. Each continues on their own paths with intention. The landscape is lush, but not hospitable. Sharp fronds and thorny cacti line their paths, and towering palms frame the mountain range and suggest the vastness of the terrain. Debray's plate description does not specifically discuss the palmito vendor as Muslim, but he does note the figure's distinctive headgear, writing, quote, "His costume is simple and his cap is reminiscent of a Greek headpiece," end quote. While Debray does not recognize its religious connotations, his description suggests he identifies the cap as a fez, or kufi, headgear associated with Islam and the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. Captioned The Black Surgeon, plate 46 sheds light on the medical practices of West African Muslims in diaspora. Here, a figure wears a medical sachet and seahorse amulet around the necks. Muslim marabouts had a long tradition of performing faith-based medicine with the use of herbs, amulets, prayers, and incantations. In the context of Brazil, these practices were syncretically combined with other African and indigenous traditions. Debré describes the surgeon's employment of suction cups for medical purposes, as we see here, as well as free consultations for underserved visitors with prescriptions and amulets available at a cost for a variety of ailments. At the far left, a reclining figure fully wrapped in a white bubu signals again Muslim identity. At the upper left, Debré notes a veiled figure of the surgeon's wife in his description, describing her as watching to collect payment for her spouse's clients. Her coverings highlight, again, the couple's Muslim identity. Further references to West African Muslims in Brazil were circulated in the publication A Journey to Brazil by the controversial Harvard scientists Luis Agassiz and his wife Elizabeth Carey in 1865. With slavery only abolished in Brazil in 1888, the last place to formally end slavery globally, the Agassiz documented their impression of diverse enslaved peoples during their travels. Carey Agassiz specifically described African Muslim women, writing, quote, "They are more commonly employed as vendors of fruits and vegetables than as house servants. The women always wear a high muslin turban, a long bright colored shawl, close-fitting bracelets at the wrist made of bright colored beads. These Mohammedans are said to remain faithful to their prophet, though surrounded by the observances of the Catholic Church," end quote. These women appear in the Agassiz text as composed sitters in woodcuts based on photographs by Astal and Wanshafe in the text illustrations. Similarly, this well-known work, known as the Black or Mulata Vegetable Vendor, or Quitandiera, was painted circa 1900 by Italian board Antonio Ferrigno, known for his Brazilian landscape and genre scenes. A woman of African descent wears a turban, prayer beads, and shawl cast aside in a moment of rest. While it is unclear if the woman depicted is Muslim, her turban and shawl reflect codes of Islamic dress traditions. Scholars have noted the adoption of Muslim turban in Brazilian candomblé and umbanda practices as having roots in Malay traditions. Perhaps the most striking reference to Islam here is the woman's talisman, which we can see as this square-shaped pouch hanging at her neck. Such an amulet is worn by the sitter of the best-known West African Muslim portrait from the early Americas, that of Ayube Suleiman Diallo by William Hoare from 1733. The sitter is said to have insisted on being shown in his own Muslim dress, in a cropped beard, white turban, and with a similar talismanic pouch, containing a copy of the Quran inscribed in Arabic in his own writing. Diouf discusses white turbans in West African Islam as distinguishing scholars who have reached an educational level of exegesis of the Quran. Other scholars describe its use across the Atlantic as signaling a new kind of spiritually free and literate Muslim engaged in resistance to oppression, or continued adherence to the faith despite enslavement. It may also signal consideration by the community as a spiritual leader. Diallo is depicted here with a small impression on his forehead as well, marking prayer over time, and also wears the white bubu. Juxtaposing this garment with the turban and talismanic pouch in Diallo's portrait, the artist fulfilled the sitter's fervent request to be requested, seen, and understood as a devout West African Muslim. While Islamic talismans were a key element of Muslim self-representation, they also held revolutionary connotations. João José Reis has highlighted the role of Muslim amulets in the organization of the Malay 1835 revolt in Bahia. Press documents described the rebellion as holding text in Arabic and circulated in the form of books, amulets, and rings, as playing a critical role in disseminating information among the local Muslim slave community about the organization of the rebellion. The vast majority of these materials were confiscated, but several pieces survive in the archive of the state of Bahia. References to the Quran, such as the Night of Destiny, and other key religious phrases, such as the Bismillah, mark the manuscript's authors as Muslim. The press also noted rebels as dressed in white, signaling their understanding of the uprising as a holy war. The consequences for affiliations with visual markers of Islam after the 1835 rebellion were dire. Authorities moved swiftly to punish anyone in possession of such items with imprisonment, lashes, or death, leading to the criminalization of Muslim visual culture in Brazil around this period. Despite the repression of Malay visual culture in the Americas at this time, Afro-Brazilian returnees crafted their own image in architectural form upon their return to the homeland, specifically in the southwest area along the Bight of Benin, Porto Novo, and Lagos. After the failed insurrection in Bahia and an anti-Muslim, anti-African effort to deport all perceived, quote, dangerous Africans back to Africa ensued, hundreds of suspected men and women were deported to present-day Benin in November of 1835, followed by a subsequent thousands over the later decades until abolition. As many Afro-Brazilian returnees were masons or architects, their skills were employed in constructing buildings which architecturally evoked Brazilian styles, but with new innovative aspects. The Shirabe Mosque in Lagos presents a key case study of this Afro-Brazilian style. Its construction began in 1891 after the patronage of, under the patronage of a Muslim African businessman and philanthropist of Yoruba descent, who hired Brazilian architect João Baptista Costa to design the building, which was inaugurated in 1894. The exterior evokes Bahian cathedrals, but features a Muslim star and crescent finial design. The facade is also more stylized and flattened in its African context. Alternately, its interior space converts the Christian apse into an Islamic mihrab space and maintains the opera box balcony seating of Bahian churches, but transforms them into galleries for women's worship. Unlike Bahian churches, which are muted in color on their exterior, the Afro-Brazilian mosques features bright, often pastel complementary colors across both interior and exterior. Thus, these structures uniquely combine trans-regional architectural influences as a new monument to Afro-Brazilian Muslim survival. The representations of and by West African Muslims tied to Brazil in the 19th century surveyed here stress the complexity of the visual culture tied to this diasporic community. Some images, such as Debray's Black Surgeon, present Malay's figures with agency and specialized knowledge. Other depictions, like those of Agassiz and Ferrinho, record modes of Muslim dress, particularly talismanic amulets. While associated with both Islamic religion and rebellion, these talismans highlight the importance of Arabic literacy for Malays in Brazil, which ultimately led to Afro-Brazilian repatriation and a new mark on the urban fabric via new architectural styles. Thus, while prints and portraiture circulated imagery of West African Muslims across the Atlantic, Islamic dress, amulets, and architecture served as key modes in which Malays constructed their own identity in diaspora and upon their return. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline. It was a very interesting piece. Maybe we already have a comment for you in the chat. And remember, everyone, that the questions for all the panelists will be done at the end. I welcome our last panelist today, Matthew Johnson. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the session. So briefly, Matthew is a professor of art history in the Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and he did his PhD in art history around the topic of landscape in 19th century American illustrated books in the University of Chicago, and he has published some, his most recent paper is Construction of Native Spirituality in Adolf Bandelier's Ethnological Research in the Southwest from 2009. His paper for today is titled The Landscape of Prehistory, Mesa Verde and the Framing of the Past in United States Archaeology. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me and see the PowerPoint?
We can.
It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank the organizers for having me here. I have to say this is my first Zoom academic conference and everyone looks great. I'm very impressed with how professional everybody is, and I hope I can hold up that standard. Yes, the title of my paper is The Landscape of Prehistory, Mesa Verde, and the Framing of the Past in American Archaeology. In Indian Country, God's Country, a recent study of the development of American Indian historical sites as national parks, Philip Burnham discusses how Mesa Verde National Park, which we see here, located in southwestern Colorado, presents unique challenges for indigenous peoples seeking to assert more control over their cultural patrimony and to reap a larger share of the economic benefits of sharing it with others. Mesa Verde contains some of the most recognizable ancient ruins in the US, including the so-called Cliff Palace and Spruce Tree House, sites occupied and then vacated by ancestral Puebloans in the 13th century. The passing of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, promised a new era for indigenous peoples in the United States by providing formal legal means for the return of human remains and artifacts held in museum collections, as well as a greater voice in decision-making and profit sharing at physical sites. However, as Burnham points out, the fact that descendant tribes of the original Mesa Verde inhabitants, such as the Hopi, no longer live in its vicinity has complicated efforts to take advantage of NAGPRA. More specifically, NAGPRA doesn't provide guidance on how to eliminate tribal claims that are weakest, influencing non-Puebloan tribes currently residing near Mesa Verde to argue for some connection to this site. Most of all, the increasingly commercialized park itself has an obvious monetary interest in preventing Puebloan tribes from asserting such an exclusive tribal claim, deeming it far better to negotiate with several weak parties rather than a single strong one. For many parties today then, both native and non-native, there's an incentive to disconnect Mesa Verde from any strong connection to recent history, to generalize its significance as an ancient indigenous settlement. This paper examines how the establishment of the Mesa Verde National Park in 1906 was abetted by archaeological reporting practices that supported a similar disconnection of the site from recent history in order to assert its status as a reified embodiment of a generalized notion of prehistory. Just as contemporary conflicts over historical connections stem from NAGPRA-mandated protocols, here too, the cultivation of a new and distinct notion of prehistory was tied to legislation, the American Antiquities Act, which was passed in the same year, 1906, as the founding of the park. However, while NAGPRA facilitates, however imperfectly, the repatriation of ancient indigenous sites and artifacts, the American Antiquities Act identified them as common national property to the extent that they were deemed prehistoric. This paper considers first how native ruins are related to history in early archaeological reports devoted to sites in the US Southwest. It then looks more closely at the first detailed archaeological reports on the site at the turn of the century. Gustav Nordenschuld's Cliff Dwellers of the Mesa Verde from 1893, and Jesse Walter Fuchs' Antiquities of the Mesa Verde National Park from 1909 and 1911. In reinforcing the perception of Mesa Verde as a historically disconnected prehistoric site, Fuchs's report differs from its forerunner in several key aspects. Specifically, its consolidation of distinct structures, namely how many there are and which are noteworthy, its shift from an analytical to a descriptive mode of writing, and finally, its cultivation of a photographic aesthetic that bolsters the sense of a timeless ruin and which stands in marked contrast to more picturesque modes of picturing ruins utilized more commonly in the previous century. The territorial expansion of the US over the course of the 19th century was most often accompanied by the forced removal of Native American tribes from areas that were desired for settlement. This process was encouraged by the notion of Native American cultural inferiority in particular as reflected in the absence of substantial permanent native architecture. With the acquisition of the Southwest in the aftermath of the US-Mexican War at mid-century, however, it became clear that cultural inferiority could no longer be argued on those grounds, as numerous sites like Mesa Verde pointed to an extended history of more impressive indigenous architectural achievement. Instead, the first archaeological investigations of these sites, for example, by John Russell Bartlett or Adolphe Bandelier, tended to argue for some notion of cultural deterioration or stagnation, to conform with pre-existing biases towards Native Americans and to deny complicity in bringing about changes that adversely affected Native American life at the time. Looking ahead to the photographic presentation of ruins in Fuchs's work on Mesa Verde, it's striking how often the illustrations of ruins in these early reports adopt some version of the picturesque view common in European landscape representations. Thus, in Bartlett's account of the US-Mexican boundary survey from 1854, which is notable for its proto-archaeological investigation of numerous ancient sites, the illustration of Casas Grandes in Chihuahua presents it in a fashion similar to Thomas Cole. Here, this is the illustration from Bartlett's report of Casas Grandes, and I'm comparing it with Thomas Cole's contemporary landscape painting of the Roman Campagna from 1843. So Thomas Cole is a painter who pioneered the adaptation of European picturesque conventions in the US. And so there are a number of parallels between these images. In both images, the artist amplifies the perception of age by emphasizing the jagged contour of the ruin, suggesting its ongoing active deterioration and eventual return to natural as opposed to man-made forms. While in both images, you can see a present-day spectator. You can see them here in the lower left, or here, this shepherd. They are seen to be clearly detached from the time of its actual use. They're just really disconnected from it. The illustration of the Presidio of San Eliazario in the same report suggests a comparable historical remove, even though the ruin here is the result of war between the US and Mexico, concluded just a few years prior to Bartlett's visit. In the first illustration, the grandeur of Casas Grandes contrasts with Bartlett's characterization of current native settlements as crude or insignificant. While in the second illustration, the suggestion of age encourages a positive outlook on recent territorial acquisitions in the Southwest, essentially that the aftermath of war is a thing of the past. Nonetheless, most archaeologists working in this region in the second half of the 19th century affirm the historical connection between ancient sites like Mesa Verde and living Native Americans. Again, to the degree that the ruin conveys the sense of long eclipsed grandeur, asserting a historical connection with contemporary Native peoples both reflects poorly on their existing habitations and helps to absolve the viewer of any responsibility for that discrepancy. Now I'm looking at the time, and so I'm just going to skip a little bit. 50 years later, the reports on the Mesa Verde ruins by Nordenskjöld and Fuchs present a markedly different perspective on Native American history, brought about in large part by the introduction of prehistory as a defining temporal concept demarcating the object of archaeological investigation as the discipline became more professionalized over the course of the 19th century. Much has been written about how this concept has served both to facilitate the effective ownership of indigenous history by an academic discipline purporting to tell the truth about the past, as well as to consign living Native peoples to a historically antecedent position to the extent that prehistoric culture is seen as a pure expression of what is distinctive about a culture. In other words, one untainted by the modern world. Nonetheless, even within the short span of time between the publication of their works, again, 1893 and 1909, Fuchs accentuates the presentation of Mesa Verde as a historically disconnected prehistoric site in order to constitute it as part of the nation's cultural patrimony. The first key difference in the report's presentation of the Mesa Verde ruins is the greater definition given to distinct structures within the different ancestral Puebloan sites in the area. Part of the reason for this difference is that Nordenskjöld was the first archaeologist to visit Mesa Verde, and while most of the ruins there had already been discovered, basically by the Wetherill family, some ranchers who owned the land, Nordenskjöld conducted the first systematic excavations and detailed mapping activities of key locations such as the Cliff Palace and Spruce Tree House. And so I'm jumping ahead here. This is a map of the site by Nordenskjöld, and this is the same map by Fuchs. The greater definition given to distinct structures by Fuchs also corresponds with giving them a permanent form as elements within a prehistoric display that will remain unchanged for all time, with neither existing buildings being further restored, nor additional buildings added in the future. Fuchs's excavations and repair work, in other words, establishes a kind of archaeological ground zero, as reflected in a comparison of the author's maps of the Cliff Palace, which we're seeing here. The speculative dotted lines and undifferentiated blank spaces of Nordenskjöld's map have been replaced by more numerous and sharply defined spaces. Note especially the multiplication of circular kivas. These are traditionally male ceremonial spaces. He also has demarcated different zones or quarters in the site and is labeling distinct terraces. Many of the photographic illustrations in Fuchs's report pointedly show the difference between before repairing and after repairing various structures. So at the top, before repairing, at the bottom, after repairing. There are numerous illustrations of this kind. In keeping with the effort to present a definitive and unchanging example of a prehistoric settlement, Fuchs also shifts his writing from the active analytical mode found in Nordenskjöld's report to a more static descriptive style. Both reports devote considerable space to straightforward description, but Nordenskjöld more consistently attempts to link patterns in architectural style and designs in pottery and textiles to comparable examples from current and past Puebloan cultures. In contrast, as Fuchs writes in the opening pages of his report on the Cliff Palace, its key contribution is that it contains the most important descriptions of the Cliff Palace, specifically of what he calls the requirements of a type ruin, namely the baseline example of ancestral Puebloan architecture. Fuchs briefly enumerates various artifactual remains, but he concentrates almost exclusively on architecture. While he does link the stylistic traits of Mesa Verde buildings to contemporary Hopi architecture, it is principally to emphasize the site's disconnection from nearby Ute tribes and to maintain the superiority of ancestral Puebloan design and masonry technique, as if later modifications were deviations from a standard. Finally, though, the intention to present a national treasure and not a historically and culturally contingent lived environment is most evident in the photographic aesthetic of the timeless ruin utilized throughout Fuchs's report. First, while Nordenskjöld's report is generously illustrated with views of various Mesa Verde ruins, they are notable for their inclusion of human figures, namely members of Nordenskjöld's own expedition party. And we'll look at that here. These are just a few illustrations. Not only do these few figures give a sense of scale, they historicize the moment of the photograph's creation, as well as revealing their outsider status as they awkwardly navigate or inhabit these spaces. Nordenskjöld is also more apt to show the ruin as part of the larger landscape, which is a holdover from the picturesque view of earlier archaeological reports like Bartlett's. Whereas the views given in Fuchs' report are either of single structures or groups of structures, or the now familiar tableau-like ruin ensconced and isolated underneath a sheltering cliff overhang, which is a very common sort of tourist image. So here's an example from Nordenskjöld's reports. You're seeing much more of the landscape, whereas in the Fuchs report, there's just the isolated ruin or this sort of familiar overhang image. Most of all, the photographs capture the meticulously repaired surfaces, evident as larger expanses of unmodulated tone compared to the more uneven and mottled textures of Nordenskjöld's photographs, in which the given structure assumes its permanent form. Both an evident ruin and oddly cleaned up, no longer exhibiting the hallmarks of encroaching decay that was emphasized in the picturesque view. Whereas in Nordenschildt's time, the Cliff Palace was visited and utilized by both ranchers and members of the local Ute tribe. Unlike Bartlett's inscription, the ruins in Bartlett's report, this site will evidently no longer register the effects of ongoing history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I know that we are a bit over time, but we already have some interesting questions. Matt has his hand raised, and also Rachel. So first, Matt, you go.
I'll try to be brief. This is for Maria Beatriz. I'm just curious about the protocols for Native American archival materials. I'm just wondering about the process by which that was made, official. What was the mechanism for tribal participation? Are there tribes that are left out or that didn't participate, that disagree with those protocols, that kind of thing?
There we go.
Yes,
well, thank you very much for that question. So my understanding is that it started with a group of specialists in archival materials that concerned the different Native American communities, but also First Nations from Canada and Aboriginal peoples from Australia. So it is more of a transnational group of specialists in archives who collaborated in this. And they only represented 18 different tribal communities from across the board. So absolutely there is, not every single tribal nation is represented. And I don't think that it has a super official character, but it is often referenced in some journals that are run and edited by Indigenous scholars. And usually these are also the protocols that I know some different institutions like the Morgan Library, for example, have been looking at to try to reconsider how they are listing their materials. And I think that Elizabeth Cronin had just mentioned on the chat that the NYPL is also trying to make an effort to reconsider how some materials are described. So I think that this is the one resource that different institutions, specifically in the English-speaking world, can refer to try to implement these changes. But they are, of course, not complete, and I don't think that they are considered to be universal, but I think that they are the best resource that we have available right now.
Thank you, Maria Beatriz. Now, Rachel, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Those were really terrific papers, and I'm not sure to whom I should address this question, but it was a question that was provoked by what Remy said about making the hide, the ground of the painting, visible again, and drawing our attention to it, not as the grounds for an absence, but as a kind of literal presence. And it made me think that in an analogous, but if opposite way to how those hides have long been seen as missing landscape, a lot of the other images that we've been looking at today, including in the talks that were just presented, there's a way in which we only see those as landscapes, right? And so the material ground is absent to us. That is to say, we don't see the material ground. We don't see the paper. We don't see the pigment. We don't see we don't see the literal presence of the thing that is not landscape. And I'd be curious to hear those of you who spoke just now just speculate about what an attention to the material, the materiality of the objects you presented today might bring to a rethinking, or add to your already wonderful rethinking of them.
So does anybody wants to take that, Matt? Okay.
I just briefly, and I'm not going to answer this very well, but I think the more that I was looking at this Fuchs report, and it's really dry reading, but I think it's easy to, and it's often something that I'm constantly coming across in the work that I do, but looking at these like reports, it's so easy to look past the materiality of the image. You're just looking at an illustration, and it's so to me it's kind of somewhat analogous to how photographs are often talked about, where you kind of look past the sheen of the photograph and its specific like tactility and so on, and you're just kind of looking at the thing that's depicted, and so that would be, because I think what I notice is the way that these photographs and their illustration in this report is trying to sort of clean up the surface of the wall and make it this, often these ruins are talked about or connected with abstract art, that kind of thing, and so this kind of three-dimensional abstract architectural space, and I do think the materiality reinforces that.
Maybe Rami, Maria Beatriz, or Caroline, do you want to compliment, or no? Is that okay?
I can't tell if Caroline's about to speak, but yeah, Caroline, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sure. That's always the challenge with the unmuting of the microphone. Such great questions. I really appreciate your comments, Rachel. And also it was very interesting, in terms of thinking about materiality, interesting to hear the other comments that were brought up, with regards to the depictions of indigenous material culture and how that linked to identity. And I was thinking how productive that is for me in terms, of thinking about materiality and the significance of place and this act of wearing with the amulets. That was a very enriching question for me that really, I would really love to think further about, and kind of thinking about with regards to the issue of materiality, how oppressed peoples, in the case of the enslaved Muslim community that I'm looking at, or in the indigenous peoples that are, faced with forced relocation and genocide, how are they able to use distinct forms from the buffalo hides to maintain their identity? How is that also misinterpreted in the primary source text? That's kind of one of the things that is challenging to me in terms of reading primary source accounts about, encounter or records of enslaved people in the case of Brazil, kind of misreadings of these objects, and then also the fear of misreading the objects yourself. So I definitely want to spend more time thinking about the materiality. I appreciate those questions. And I also appreciate, this invitation to think more about the significance of place in addition to the relationship of these objects to the wearer.
Okay, Rami, go ahead. If you wanted to say something before. Question, Rachel. We also have some other questions in the chat. And there's one for Caroline about the Negra Quitandera. And I would like for you to do it in public, not just in the chat, so that we can all learn a bit more about this piece that was very interesting, the 100%.
Sure. And I will confess here that I'm also very excited to learn more about this piece. So basically what I presented there was some information based on the work of Maria Cristo Vieira, who has written a bit about this piece in the context of a larger production of works around the 1900s, so post-abolition, in which African women became a prominent subject of painting. And so the Negra Quitandera image, which is a tricky title to translate, it can be thought of as, sometimes it's called the Negra Quitandera, it's also been referred to as Mulata Quitandera, which can be thought of as black or mulata vegetable or greengrocer. So it's interesting to look closely at that image and that title. I really want to continue finding out more about this piece, but I think what is so striking is that all of those visual elements in terms of the Islamic amulet have not been addressed yet. And that is very much in line with the descriptions in print culture. Again, it might not necessarily indicate a Muslim identity, because in Bahia, many of these forms of visual culture were adopted more widely, like the white turban, which is very much associated with Bahianas. But scholars have identified the roots of that tradition, of those clothing traditions, as tied to Malay culture. So it's interesting to think about the syncretism that might be happening there. But I am looking more into, the meaning of the amulets. This is, as you can probably tell, at its very initial stages, this project. But I'm very much excited to look more into the presence of those amulets. This painting in particular was the newest addition to the research I've been compiling. But I do feel it's very striking in the way that all of those visual cues tied to a Muslim legacy more broadly in Bahian culture comes through in that image. But I'm also excited, if anybody also knows more about this piece, I would be excited to have conversations with you about it.
Thank you, Caroline. I just wanted to say something. It's just a comment, not a question. I'm an archaeologist, so all of your papers also led me thinking about landscape and how we can address it. Of course, as archaeologists, we try to find this imprints in land, right? The structures and how it changed, and most of your papers had that in common, that it's things that we cannot really see, and the ruin that it's not inhabited, and we're not very sure of what's happening, who is entitled to it. And I would like to just bring that up and just build more bridges between the two disciplines, because I do think that the current archaeologists, not the ones that you have referred to in your papers, are more knowledgeable on like this other type of appropriations that are not directly just affecting the land, and that of course are evidence of how people related to these spaces in the past, and how that has been depicted from like in the different study cases that you presented today. So thank you so much for this meeting. I was very pleased with all of the papers and the participation of everyone. And I invite you to come back next Friday. We have our next session. Thank you so much to all the panelists and the organizers. Thank you, Catherine, Veronica, Rachael, for everything today.
Thank you, Natalia, also for moderating. It's been a wonderful first morning. Thank you, everyone, and Rachael again, Catherine, and we'll see you next Friday. Remember that if you registered, you have a different Zoom link for next Friday, and we will be uploading the authorized panels on our website and on the YouTube channel. So thank you again. I hope to see you next Friday.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for organizing.
You're welcome. Bye. Bye, everyone.